Hey guys, today we're going to wander back into a world where your neighbours weren't just people you waved to when you took out the trash. They were also your co-workers, fellow stone haulers, mud stirrers and occasional amateur architects. You are standing in a medieval village, eyes still foggy from sleep, and someone is already shouting about the wall. Yes, the wall. The defensive wall that everyone agreed had to go up, because otherwise you probably won't survive this. Not exactly a relaxing start to the day, but hey, welcome to the Middle Ages. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And because I'm curious, comment your location and your local time down below. I like to know where in the world you're listening from while drifting into dreamland. Now picture it, the faint tolling of a bell from the church tower echoes over the rooftops. The sound carries on the morning wind, mingling with the smells of damp earth and wood smoke. Everyone in the village knows that bell isn't just a call to prayer, it's also the work signal. You trudge out of your thatched cottage, rubbing sleep from your eyes, and head toward the half-built stone wall at the edge of town. Your sandals, or maybe just your bare feet, squish in the dew-soaked grass. A dog barks. Chickens scatter underfoot. Someone is already hauling a wagon of stones, and you realize the day's heavy lifting has begun without you. Typical. The reason entire villages pitched in was simple survival. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of tiny lordships, fiefdoms, and rival claimants, who all thought your patch of land would look better on their family crest. Without walls, your home was vulnerable to raids, bandits, or just the neighbouring baron who got bored and fancied a new tax base. Walls meant safety. Walls meant your kids could sleep without wondering if a horseman would ride through the door at midnight. Walls, in short, were life insurance, the one you had to build with your own calloused hands. But here's where it gets oddly communal. Unlike the glossy images of knights and kings pointing dramatically at blueprints, most castle and wall construction wasn't led by a single mastermind. It was powered by villagers ordinary. You roped into the effort through obligation, loyalty, or just the plain fact that if you didn't help, the wall wouldn't be finished and you'd all be in trouble. Everyone had a job. If you were strong, you hauled stones. If you were precise, you shaped blocks. If you were neither, you fetched water or shooed geese out of the mortar. Historians still debate how much was voluntary service versus corvée labour. That's the fancy term for unpaid labour demanded by your lord. But either way, your muscles were going to ache. A mainstream fact you can hold on to in England and France, especially many town charters legally bound residents to contribute days of labour to defensive works. It wasn't optional. It was written into the survival contract of being part of a borough or commune. In places like Carcassonne, villagers worked side by side with stonemasons, literally raising walls that still tower today. Think of it as medieval community service with slightly more splinters. A quirky tidbit to amuse you: some villages sweetened the deal by turning wall building into half festival, half workday. There are records of barrels of ale rolled up to construction sites, so you're mixing mortar with one hand and holding a wooden mug with the other. Imagine a medieval construction site that doubles as a beer garden. Productivity might dip after lunch, but morale was high. And of course, historians still argue about the details. Some claim the sheer scale of castle walls meant villagers only did grunt work, while trained masons did the precise stuff. Others insist villagers learned more skills than we give them credit for, because the sheer repetition of hauling stones taught you how to place them snugly. Honestly, after your 100th rock, you'd probably know exactly which corner to chip. You hear the bell again, and now it's time to drag yourself into line. Your neighbours shuffle along beside you, grumbling softly, breath misting in the cool air. Some laugh, some yawn. You feel the rough rope handles of a cart dig into your palms as you join the morning shift. The village looks less like a sleepy cluster of cottages and more like a bustling construction site. The irony is, you wanted a peaceful night's sleep, but to get that peace, you have to sweat through endless days of lifting. The wall is rising slowly, one stone, one log, one smear of mortar at a time. As you trudge forward with your next load, you realize today's duties are only just beginning. You may be hauling stones this morning, but by evening, the job will change, and not in the way you expect. You wake in the grey edge of morning to the scrape of iron on stone, a sound like a giant cat sharpening its claws on the hillside. The dew is still clinging to the hedges, and the air smells faintly of crushed nettles and cold ash. You and a knot of neighbours trudge along the cart-rutted lane toward the quarry, the village shrinking behind you, the half-built wall a jagged silhouette that keeps glancing over its shoulder to make sure you're coming back with more. Your shoulders already feel the memory of yesterday's weight. Your palms remember the rope handles, and your mouth remembers the taste of grit limestone dust, has a way of settling on your tongue like an unwanted breakfast. By the time you crest the low rise, the quarry is awake in the only way a hole in the earth can be soft voices. A low clink of metal, the scuff of boots, the snort of mules, and somewhere a kettle trying to decide whether it's a pot or a whistle. You join the line at the tool chest, really just a plank on pegs, where chisels and hammers lie like sleepy dogs. You choose a chisel that still has a face, and a hammer with a handle that won't divorce you mid-swing. Your neighbour gives you the nod reserved for people about to do something heroic and repetitive. A mainstream fact to anchor you: medieval quarries for castle works were usually local, sometimes nothing grander than a widened ditch along a limestone outcrop. Hauling rock from far away was ruinously expensive, so the stone under your feet or a short haul downriver usually became the wall above your head. Quarrying wasn't an act of brute chaos, it followed patterns. You score a channel along the bed with a pick. You set iron wedges, feathers and wedges, as later craft folk call them, into small holes you've coaxed with a narrow chisel. Then you tap, tap, tap in rhythm until the seam gives with a sigh you feel through your boots. It's not unlike persuading a loaf to crack just right in the oven, except the loaf weighs as much as your house. You crouch at the edge, testing the face of a block with your knuckles like you're checking a melon at market. The stone talks back in dull answers, too soft, too crumbly, just right, depending on how the sound travels through the bed. Someone jokes that you've become a stone whisperer, and you grin because yes, you can tell where to place the next wedge by the way the chisel sings a thin bell note that rides the morning breeze. Not a fancy science, perhaps, but it's your science. Another blow, then another, and the block loosens with a gasp. Dust lifts and floats, turning the air to milk. Your shoulders take the next job personally. You ease a pry bar beneath the slab. A friend pushes a wooden Lewis, a simple lifting dog, into a slot to grip. Ropes go taut. The block tilts, resisting like a sleepy ox. The grit under your soles rolls, and for a second, you imagine sliding down the face like a child on winter ice, only less fun, and with more limestone. A mule shifts its weight and flicks an ear. Even it is unimpressed by your leverage. You lean together again, a chorus line of determined backs, and the stone finally flops onto a sledge with the weary authority of a town elder claiming a chair. The mule pretends this was its idea all along. Quirky tidbit for your pocket: some crews named their best block stubborn beauties called Fat Marjorie, Sleepy Ricard, or Blessed Stubborn. It's easier to bully a stone when you can scold it by name. And a few quarries nursed small superstitions. The first block of the day might get a whisper of ale dribbled over it to keep the seam kind, the same way you'd season a skillet. You haven't found proof that the stone cares, but it certainly doesn't complain. You pause to drink from a leather costrel. The water is cool and slightly leafy, like it borrowed yesterday's mint and forgot to return it. The wind sneaks across the open cut, combing the grass above into gentle ripples. Somewhere far off, a church bell ticks a quiet bead on the rosary of the morning 1-2-3, your unofficial timepiece. No one here owns a clock, and the sun is still negotiating with a cloud. The bell and the wind do the scheduling for you. "Ready?" your neighbour asks, already knowing the answer. You take the sledge ropes and together you begin the long, slow drag toward the cart. The runners hiss on sand. Your boots chew the ground. The mule, which has already composed an epic poem about not being compensated, fairly deigns to walk. You keep the rhythm with soft sounds. Step, step, a personal chant that makes the distance shorter. When the cart's bed kisses the sledge, the whole crew exhales, as if one body had been mystically subdivided into many, each person a rib around a shared lung. Historians still argue whether villages like yours ran quarry shifts under a formal corvée, days of obligatory service owed to the Lord, or as paid day labour peppered with in-kind rewards like bread and ale. Records show both. In some places, a mason's guild supervised the cut, with villagers acting as carriers. In others, the lines blurred as you picked up technique through repetition and watching a master's hands. The paper trail is thinner than the dust you're coughing, which means the debate can keep scholars politely squabbling while you keep sledging. All you know is that the wall will not grow unless the quarry keeps breathing stones onto carts. You heft the pry bar again, and someone calls for wedges. You slide the iron into the drilled slots, a neat trick that demands patience, and begin the gentle quarrel of hammer on feather. The quarry answers in tiny tremors like a cat purring under a table. A boy no older than 12, 2 parts elbows and 1 part enthusiasm, counts the taps. 9, 10, 11. You wink and tell him he's on quality control, which makes his chest inflate like a small bellows. He hands you a fresh wedge with the solemnity of a royal scribe passing a charter. Another block yields, another sledge kisses rope, another mule composes a grievance, and you permit yourself a small modern aside, because if you don't, your brain might simply fold closed for the day. This is cardio strength training, team building, occupational therapy for stubbornness, and a management seminar on the gentle art of negotiating with rocks like CrossFit if the gym were a cliff and the membership perk was dust. The cart takes shape, 4 good blocks, then 5, then 6. You cap the load with a shaggy cushion of brush to stop the stones from gossiping themselves into chips during the ride. A driver checks the axles, tightens a pin with a mallet, and pats the mule in the vague area of its patience. Then you set off for the road, a slow procession with dignity borrowed from the weight in your care. The world narrows to the crunch of gravel, the bump of ruts, the squeak of wheels, the stitched shadow of oak leaves sliding across the cargo. 2 children trot alongside, admiring the stones as if they were exotic animals. A quick fact to ease the academic itch: some sites did employ treadwheel cranes, giant hamster wheels for humans to hoist blocks at the building ground. Whether they showed up this early in your valley is a question for Section 17, but you've heard rumours from a distant town with a crane so tall it needed its own weather report. If true, it will save your back later. If not, your back will send a letter to management. Halfway home, you pass the river and you can't help weighing a counterfactual boats. Barges could float 3, 6, 10 times your current load if the bank were right and the current kindly. Some builders did exactly that, turning a river into a conveyor belt. In your case, the bank is sullen and the bend is rude, so you accept the wisdom of hooves and wheels for now. But you make a mental note to mention the barge fantasy at the evening ale. Someone always knows someone with a cousin who can coax a boat into behaving. At the village edge, the wall lifts its growing chin as if sniffing the air to see what flavour of rock you've brought. The masons glance up appraise and nod good stone, honest faces, a day's work in a cart. You like their nods. They feel like stamps, little approvals that say your morning had a purpose beyond collecting dust. You start unloading sliding blocks onto the ground with the care you'd give a sleeping child, and a small laugh arrives when one of the stones, Fat Marjorie, refuses to fit any sensible category and has to be rotated like a puzzle piece. She'll be perfect in a corner, you decide. Stubborn stones have corner energy. By the time the cart is empty, the sun has turned confident, the bell has told another quiet secret, and your arms are writing poetry to your shoulders about the nature of ache. The quarry is calling again, as it always will, because walls are hungry. But before you answer, you notice a new team assembling under the alder trees. Axes, wedges, a pair of sawyers measuring a trunk with a cord, the scent of fresh sap, trying to outrun the smell of stone dust. The wall may be stone, but the sky steps to build it are timber, and no stone rises without a forest's consent. You wipe your hands, share a look with your neighbour, and let the wind twist a strand of hair across your cheek like a bookmark. The day's next chapter is waiting in the woods, and it's louder than you think. You leave the stone's cool breath behind and head for the trees where the air changes personality. It becomes sticky with sap and sweet with the shy perfume of crushed needles, and you can taste resin on the back of your tongue, the way you taste honey when the lid of the jar is stuck. A woodpecker is already conducting roll call, tap, 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 and somewhere a saw answers with a longer, sleepier note. You step beneath leaves that sift the sunlight into coins, and then spend them one by one along the undergrowth. In this cathedral of trunks, your job isn't lifting mountains. It's persuading pillars to lie down and become sky steps. You join the timber crew, a bundle of neighbours whose hands look like maps, calluses where roadways should be, and little scars where villages might go. Axes lean against a stump like faithful dogs. There's a two-man frame saw taller than a person slouched between stakes, as if embarrassed to be this big. You pick up a felling axe and feel its head settle into the groove at the base of your thumb, the way a well-worn cup finds the same ring on a table every morning. The first tree on the list chosen yesterday with a nod from the reeve and a prayer from a passing granny waits like a drummer keeping time just ahead of you. A mainstream fact to ground this forest reverie: medieval walls were stone, yes, but their rise depended on timber in almost ridiculous quantities. Scaffolding alone devoured poles. Temporary hoardings, those wooden walkways that later let defenders rain polite discouragement on intruders, needed stout beams. Gates, portcullises, and drawbridge frames ate hardwoods for breakfast. In many regions, a formal assart or woodland allotment supplied civic works with cutting overseen by the Lord's Forester or by town officers, ensuring nobody mistook the wall project for free firewood day. Without timberstone can't get off its knees. You mark your first notch on the windward side, just a small mouth where the tree will start its long conversation with the earth. The bite of the axe is crisp, a sound that rings up your bones. Chips fly in pale confetti, and the tree starts to breathe louder. A wooden sigh that makes you wonder whether you've signed up for forest theatre. 2 blows, 4-6. Your partner takes a turn, then you again, a duet, whose chorus is rhythm more than melody. There's a trick to this: you listen. You watch the fibres, you aim, not only at the trunk, but at where the trunk will want to go, which is rarely where gravity, malice, and whimsy will let it. A quirky tidbit sneaks in. Some crews smear a little tallow on the axe cheeks to keep sap from gluing the steel to the cut part, practical part ritual. Others chew on lumps of spruce resin forest toffee to keep thirst in check, and breath pine-scented romantic unless you swallow the bark. One old-timer insists you should always pocket the first chip from a new tree because it remembers the direction of the fall and will guide your next. You aren't sure the chip is that helpful, but it does make a satisfying worry stone. Now the hinge, that careful strip of uncut wood you leave as a living hinge, so the tree will pivot instead of performing a surprise pirouette. You glance at the crown, always watching for dead limbs that prefer your skull to the ground, and then call the warning a long, well-worn shout that even squirrels respect. Your partner drives wedges into the back cut with wooden mallets, a drumbeat building to something you can feel in your shoulder blades. The trunk trembles, complains, leans, and then commits. In that last second, everything in the forest holds its breath, the insect hum, the bird chatter, even your own lungs. The tree settles forward in slow motion, and then finishes in one long, soft thunder. Leaves puff a green sigh. Needles sprinkle themselves like confetti at a coronation. The forest exhales and then pretends nothing happened. You buck the trunk into lengths, scaffolding poles, joists, short braces that will keep platforms from wobbling like a tavern table. The two-man saw comes into play now, one of you above the pit, one of you below in a shallow trench, because gravity loves the person in the trench more than is polite. The blade's long teeth sing through fresh wood, each pull a sigh, each push a whisper. Sap freckles your forearms until you look like someone painted constellations on your skin. Above the canopy edits sunlight into gentle paragraphs. Below, sawdust rises in little golden storms that catch in your eyelashes. Another mainstream fact, because you may as well stack knowledge like cordwood: medieval scaffolding was typically built from roundwood poles lashed with rope or with whittled pegs, not the tidy steel cages of modern sites. Workers walked planks laid across putt logs, beams that slotted into holes left in the rising masonry. Those small square scars you see in old walls are not random. They tell a biography of scaffolds. The system was modular, adjusted daily, and it creaked like a ship, which is handy, because you can hear trouble before you see it. A debate you can carry like a pocket knife, historians still argue how engineered these timber systems were. Some evidence suggests sophisticated bracing patterns, near-standardized lashing techniques, even early use of iron dogs in high-stress joints. Other records make it sound like a brilliant improvisation farm. Local knowledge ad hoc fixes that brace worked last year. Try it here. The truth may be exactly your experience, a core of know-how wrapped in the creative courage of people who can fix anything with a brace, a prayer, and a longer rope. Speaking of rope, you twist bark strips into rough cords between jobs because fibre is never wasted out here. Willow withies, hazel, and even lime bast soaked and then teased into generous ribbons become fastenings that bite the wood and hold like gossip. A younger crew tests each lash by putting their weight on it and bouncing. You call that quality assurance and pretend you're running a cutting-edge safety program. Everyone laughs. The forest oddly seems to approve. You drag the first sledge of poles toward the cart. The earth under the runners hisses like a cat being polite. Donkeys are roped in literally to help their hooves, playing a calm drumbeat on the leaf litter. One donkey, entirely convinced of its managerial talents, keeps turning to check your technique. You assure it that performance reviews are after lunch. The air warms a shade. The resin's perfume deepens. A breeze sifts through, and with it the distant bell from the village, a silver thread stitching forest to town. The sound makes you realize how everything aligns: quarry, at first light timber, by late morning mortar, afternoon, watch at dusk. It's not a schedule, it's a tide. You break for a mouthful of bread and a wedge of cheese that tastes faintly of meadow and ambition. A jug goes around. The water is cool and slightly brown from yesterday's barrel, but thirst is a forgiving critic. Someone mentions a superstition. Leave a coin under the stump of the first tree you fell for the wall to pay the wood back. The coin is copper and has a dimple like it once fought a hammer and lost. It goes under the roots with a small, unceremonious pat. Maybe it's gratitude, maybe it's hedge betting. Either way, the gesture sits in the soil with a quiet, contented look, like a cat finding the one warm tile in a cold kitchen. You return to the frame saw, and the pit sawyer below begins his slow, patient dance. Knees bend, arms lift, pull, and the blade hums. You keep cadence with him, push, breathe, and if you ever wanted proof that work can be music, this is it. A pair of younglings try to harmonize with a song they learned from their grandmother, a work chant that turns instructions into melody. The words describe the sequence: brace, mark, cut, lift, and the tune refuses to leave your head, even as sawdust insists on joining you in both nostrils. Another debate to slip into your pocket for later coppicing versus high forest. Some regions relied heavily on coppice management, cutting trees to the stool, so they regrew into a thicket of poles perfect for scaffolding fences, and occasionally arguments about whose goats have better manners. Others prized straight-grained high forest trunks for long beams and gate frames. The documentary trail is a mosaic. What you feel under your hands is that both systems can feed a wall, and both require patience measured in seasons rather than hours. The wall teaches you the clock of trees. By early afternoon, your cart groans with poles braces and a couple of honest joists. You tally pieces with a piece of charcoal on your palm, the most private ledger in town, then smudge it on your tunic and start again. A forester inspects your harvest, nods at the straight grain like a baker, approving a good rise, and reminds you gently. Because yelling in a forest feels rude, that the best beams will be set aside for the gatehouse. A portcullis needs teeth that don't sulk when they see iron. You file that away with a note to keep the nicest heartwood out of the rain. You also make a very small joke to yourself about how a gate with good teeth feels like something a bard would write about after too much ale. The road back runs downhill, and wheels are fit with a crude drag to stop enthusiasm from becoming disaster. You pace the team hand on a pole to quiet the cart's surprised squeaks. At a stream crossing, you dunk a handful of chips and watch them water darken into richer browns and reds. You imagine the scaffolding stained by weather into the colour of stories. The breeze picks up and folds the leaf light into smaller, sleepier pieces, and for a moment you feel the edge of a nap touch your eyes. You tuck the thought away that nap may be waiting for you on a plank high above the ground, because yes, sometimes you nap where you work. The wall doesn't mind. It likes being near dreams. Back at the site, the mason masters glance over your load the way a chef smells the air of a kitchen. Approval comes as a small smile and a wave toward the growing skeleton of the scaffold. You help raise the first bay, 2 uprights bedded in tamped earth, a ledger beam across braces at jaunty angles like elbows akimbo lashings pulled until the bark cord sings. The structure answers with a creak that is not a complaint, but a greeting wood, testing its new grammar. You lay planks, tow them and feel the bounce and adjust, until the bounce becomes a conversation rather than an argument. One last fact, because your brain likes footnotes with its fatigue, those put-log holes we mentioned. Many will be filled later. Some will stare out at the centuries like tiny square winks. People in distant futures will point to them on tours and say scaffolding marks, and you will be there in that sentence anonymous, and present the way a voice lingers in a room after the singer leaves. You wipe sap from your fingers with a curl of bark, breathe in the mingled smells of stone dust, fresh wood, old rope, and lunch, and feel the day tilt toward the quieter hours. The scaffolding waits for the next trade to step up the mortar crew, with their barrels and paddles, the alchemy team that turns powder and water into glue for a civilization. You glance toward the mixing ground and see steam rise from a lime pit like a warm ghost. The wind plays with your hair again, and the bell marks the hour you didn't know you'd been keeping. You smile because the forest part is done for now. The next duty, though, it bubbles, it hisses, and it has opinions about your skin. You step toward the mixing ground, and the air changes again. Warm, damp, and a little sharp, like a bakery that got into an argument with a geology textbook. Steam rises in soft ribbons from the lime pit, blurring the edges of barrels and paddles until everything looks dream smooth. You can hear the small secret noises of work, beginning the slosh of water in a bucket, the scoop of sand, the scrape of a wooden hoe against the side of a trough, a faint fizz from quicklime meeting moisture that sounds like a whisper telling you to mind your fingers. You already know that advice. Lime is friendly from a distance and clingy up close. Your job, at least for this hour, is alchemy. You shovel sand fine, clean grains that run like warm sugar into the mixing bed. You crack open a cask of slaked lime, the paste pale as morning milk, and it breathes out a temper that can wake sleeping skin. You pour water carefully, not too fast because the line between helpful slurry and wandering soup is thinner than a mason's patience. Then comes the rhythm work. Pull the hoe, fold the sand into the lime press. With your weight, lean back, repeat. The mixture answers with a wet, sleepy murmur, the trough's wood creaking like it misses a life as a boat. Mainstream fact to anchor your hands. Good medieval mortar needed 3 things: well-burned lime that had been thoroughly slaked sand, often river or pit sand carefully chosen for grain size and water. Sometimes a bit of clay or silt wandered in and was tolerated if it behaved. The lime itself began as limestone burned in a clamp or a small kiln, the fire driving off carbon dioxide to leave quicklime, a powder that gets dramatic when it meets water. Slaking tames that drama into a silky putty, which when mixed with sand and applied between stones, slowly reabsorbs carbon from the air and turns back towards stone. It is a long romance between rock and time, and you are the matchmaker in muddy shoes. You scrape the hoe again, and the paste lifts in glossy swells. Your neighbour tests the mix with a trowel, plops a dollop on a plank, and watches how it slumps. If it sighs outward too fast, you add more sand. If it sits tall and sulks, you ladle in another breath of water. You keep going until the mortar looks like it would hold its shape through a confident conversation, but still agree to spread when asked nicely. The goal is a texture you can describe with bakery metaphors without getting hungry: thick batter, not dough. Frosting that knows when to be polite. Quirky tidbit for your inner collector. In some places, folks swore by a splash of animal hair in the mortar, horsehair, or goat hair chopped short to help control shrinkage and cracking. Others favoured a ladle of whey or soured milk, a casein trick that later centuries would recognise as a genuinely useful binder. A few crews even whispered about adding beaten egg whites for a gatehouse finish, which you suspect was either a joke at the expense of the Lord's pantry or a one-time experiment that made the walls smell like breakfast in the sun. You can neither confirm nor deny the omelette masonry incident. You fold, and with every turn you hear the grit of sand smoothing its edges in the lime bath. Your arms, which have recently written angry letters to management about quarry duty and forest duty, now discover stirring duty, which is basically lifting, but more persuasive. The breeze drifts across the yard and lifts the smell of lime into your nose, clean and chalky. A scent that somehow feels like it polishes your thoughts. You let your breathing sink with the scrape of the hoe in pull, out push, in pull, out push. It becomes a little lullaby. You hum to yourself a tiny song of slurry and patience. Historians still argue about the secret sources. Did medieval masons routinely add pozzolan's volcanic ash-crushed brick or tile dust to make mortar sets stronger and behave better in damp climates? The evidence is there in some sites, especially where Roman ruins were handy and broken tiles were basically sand with a diploma, but in other regions the recipe seems to have been purer lime sand water time. The debate gets spirited in alehouses and archives alike, and you've heard both camps present their favourite walls as Exhibit A. You smile and keep stirring. Your wall wants what your soil and your river can offer, and your hands can feel when it's right. Now comes the dance with time. Lime mortar is patient by nature, and the wall inherits that mood. You don't slap it between stones and demand instant obedience. You butter the bed, set the block, twist the stone a hair to bed it down, and let the excess squeeze out like a slow, satisfied exhale. Then you strike the joint tidy and neat, so rain will glance away instead of settling in for a long chat. The trick learned by watching the old hands work is to keep the mortar matched to the day. Hot, dry wind. You shelter the fresh joints with damp cloths so they don't crack from thirst. Cold, sulky weather. You mix a shade stiffer and accept that today's wall will rise like a careful sermon rather than a cheerful song. You shoulder a paddle and carry 2 slopping pails to the mason line. The stones you hauled at dawn are waiting with the quiet dignity of future architecture. A master points. You kneel. The trowel's steel whispers across the mortar. The joint fills. The stone settles with a sound that registers somewhere behind your heart. When it's right, you feel it in your knees. A small forgiving thud, a promise the wall makes to the ground and the sky at the same time. 2 strokes more, and you step back to see the new seam dry into a paler smile. Modern aside, because you deserve one, at this point in your shift, you are a barista for rocks. You manage viscosity, temperature, and timing. You steam the surface with damp cloths, and you listen for a hiss that tells you the mix is undercooked. The wall orders a double mortar with light sand, and you nod like this is a perfectly normal sentence. Another mainstream detail, lime kilns were often seasonal beasts fed with coppiced wood and stacked with alternating layers of fuel and stone. When the burn went well, the quicklime came out hot and brittle. When it went badly, you got half-cooked nodules that pretended to be fine until they woke up months later inside the wall and expanded like embarrassing secrets. To avoid that, crews slaked quicklime thoroughly, sometimes in pits where the paste matured for weeks or months, getting creamier and more cooperative with age. You've seen old buckets labelled with chalk marks that look a lot like birthdays. Older lime spreads like manners. Fresh lime grumbles and requires supervision. The wind threads through the scaffolding and makes the planks murmur. Somewhere a child giggles at a joke about a donkey who tried to eat a trowel and now speaks fluent metal. You let yourself laugh because humour is the 4th ingredient that keeps mortar from setting in your shoulders. A swallow dips, scribbles a curve in the sky and vanishes over the half-built parapet like it owns a tiny deed to the air. You tuck that sight away for later, when the evening feels too square. You pause to check your hands. Lime sneaks into every crease, and you've learned the ritual wash. Often oil after, and don't scratch your nose with a mortar glove, unless you want to look like you lost an argument with a snowdrift. A neighbour swears by rubbing goose fat on knuckles before a long mixing session. Another swears by wearing last year's wool at the wrist as a buffer. You swear by remembering not to swear because the bell can probably hear you. The bell has opinions. A little field debate bubbles up beside the trough. Should the next batch skew a touch richer with more lime to dress the face stones, or lean sandier for the core where the wall eats mortar like a hungry god? The master listens, nods, and decides one fat mix, one lean mix, 2 troughs, 2 teams. You admire a leadership style that sounds suspiciously like yes, and you scrape your hoe in satisfaction and start the second bed, measuring with your eye, 2 shovels sand, 1 of putty water poured as if you're writing your name in a letter to tomorrow. Hour by hour, the cadence carries you. Mix, carry, spread. Fold, test, nod. The wall digests your work in calm, slow swallows. Every few courses you brush the face joints to a tidy finish, and imagine a future hand, 500 years from now, tracing this line and telling a child, "See, that's how they did it." You don't need a plaque. This joint is your signature signed in lime that took a long, patient breath. By late afternoon, the light mellows to honey. The air smells faintly of stone, and a whiff of something sweet from the cook fire drifting across the yard, onion maybe and herb, and a promise with bread. Your shoulders loosen, as if a friendly hand remembered where your knots live. You smooth the last joint of the course, wipe the trowel on a scrap, and set your tools in a neat row, because order helps the mind get quiet. The troughs settle into silence, skinning over in a soft film that looks like sleep. You glance up the scaffold and catch a different movement, a pair of workers hauling oddly shaped frames toward the gate-mouth ribs of wood that don't look like ordinary scaffolding at all. They gleam with planed surfaces pinned with pegs and swing on ropes with the confidence of contraptions that think highly of themselves. You blink, then smile, because mortar is the wall's voice, but gates and gears are its punctuation, and punctuation can get very dramatic, very fast. You wipe your hands, stretch your back, and follow the frames with your eyes as they rise toward the future gatehouse. The next duty. It has teeth a temper and a love of gravity that borders on theatrical. You think the wall is made of stone and timber, and it is. But right now you discover it's also made of water, endless sloshing, shoulder-bruising water. You pick up the yoke, the wood polished by years of necks like yours, and you settle it across your shoulders until it finds the familiar groove between bone and stubbornness. 2 buckets hang from iron hoops, one winks in the sun where the stave meets the band, the other has a tiny leak that turns each step into a dotted line on the path. If carting stone is a conversation with gravity hauling water, is a correspondence with distance. You write the same letter to the same stream again and again, and the stream replies with the same cool signature on your wrists. The sensory world leans into the task. The wind curls downstream and brings a thin river smell, quiet mud-green weeds, a mineral hush. Leather straps creak like sleeping crickets. The buckets knock your shins just enough to make you promise to walk a little wider. You pass a fellow villager carrying a skin bag instead of wood. The leather dark and soft, something between a satchel and a cloud. And you trade that tiny smile people wear when their jobs are different, but their aches are cousins. At the bank, the water hisses around stones as if it's practicing to be soup. You crouch lower, the buckets count to 2, lift carefully so the current doesn't steal your balance, and pause for a breath, while the handles settle into the hooks like sleepy birds onto a branch. A mainstream fact to steady your steps: walls ate water by the cartload. Mortar mixing alone could drink far more than a well's comfortable output in a single morning. Add slaking lime washing tools, soaking rope, and the simple human business of thirst, and you have a job category. Many towns built or maintained conduits, public water channels, or covered pipes that carried spring water to a central trough, specifically so building trades and breweries wouldn't duel at the well. In some places, a conduit house sat like a small shrine at a junction with a spout that never quite stopped whispering into a stone basin. You pass one now and watch a trickle draw a silver line on the trough. The mason's apprentice bows to it like it's a minor saint. Honestly, right now, it feels like one. You heft the yoke and rise, testing your balance the way a ship tests its ropes. The buckets swing and then remember their manners. You step carefully, heel, then toe, a tiny dance that changes the way your whole skeleton thinks about walking. Someone calls out, "Mind the rut." And you do. Because last week a neighbour discovered that one unexpected dip can turn a balanced yoke into a slapstick routine of water dignity and extremely clean shoes. You angle uphill, breathing through your nose, listening to the small glug-glug as the buckets negotiate with the air. A quirky tidbit sidles up with a grin. The village has invented a game to make this chore less of a slog. On market days, water carriers race in slow-motion yokes poised, the rule being that the winning bucket must arrive with the highest fill line. The prize is not money. It's a ladle of honey water and the right to claim smugly that your shoulder knows the true path. Children watch with eyes like polished chestnuts. They can't decide whether the best part is the skill or the occasional comedic splash. Today isn't race day, but you carry as if someone is keeping score in the clouds. At the site, the mixing ground grows thirsty. The mortar troughs you stirred earlier are settling into that soft skin that means the lime is calming down, and they drink your delivery with a gentle, appreciative schlup. You tip steady and let the water slide around the edges, folding it in with a paddle until the paste loosens just enough to be agreeable. A mason nods. It is the nod of someone who measures compliments in millimeters. You decide to print it on your memory and wear it like a medal for an hour. Historians still argue about medieval urban water systems, how elaborate, how reliable, how much they broke at the worst moment. Some towns inherited Roman channels and tinkered them back to life. Others tapped hillside springs and ran lead or wooden pipes to street fountains. There's documentary evidence for water guilds maintaining conduits, and also for spectacular failures when drought or freeze took the pipes hostage. In rural places like yours, the debate is simpler and muddier, bucket by bucket from stream or spring, sometimes into cisterns dug near the wall so the job could be a shorter circle. Your village compromises stream for bulk well for drinking and the conduit for whoever remembers to ask politely. You take another turn at the path, this time with a friend, so you can time your steps together. It's surprising how two bodies can learn to walk like a four-legged animal in a single afternoon. You set the yokes like matching shoulders of the same ox. Conversation trickles out with the same calmness as the water you carry. You talk about nothing in particular. The taste of yesterday's ale, was it bread or meadow in a cup? The ridiculous courage of the donkey who believes it's the foreman? The loud opinion the bell has about punctuality? And the longer you talk, the more your steps forget. Their labour and start pretending they're just the way people move through a day. A woman at the well shows you a clever trick: line the bucket with a reed mat when drawing from a silty patch. It keeps the water as clear as gossip and spares the mortar from too much fine grit. She also swears that a sliver of charcoal tucked in the water skin keeps it sweet. You thank her, and she grins the way experts do when someone notices they're an expert. The village is full of these micro-inventions, tiny patents owned by memory and traded free for a good laugh or a better pie. By midday, a chain forms an honest-to-history bucket brigade. People stand a few paces apart from stream to site, and water moves along a river made of hands. Your place in the chain changes the chore's music instead of the long, solitary walk. You join a rhythm lift pass call. Got it, half turn, hand off, breathe. The line hums like a gentle machine made from neighbours. It's so easy to imagine you invented modern logistics, if only because your back is grateful to share the conversation with 30 other spines. Someone starts a call and response to keep the pace. Wet hands, dry hearts. It's not poetry, but it works. Modern aside whispered so the bell doesn't scold. This is the medieval version of a group chat, except you can see who's typing and everyone brings water instead of memes. Also, no one can mute that one guy who keeps making donkey jokes. He is, however, very strong, so he stays. Another mainstream point while the line flows water wasn't just for mixing. Ropes soaked overnight behaved better under load. Fresh-cut timber appreciated a sprinkle so it didn't drink your mortar. Even dust suppression mattered if the wind stirred too much grit into the air, joints dried poorly, and eyes complained loudly. Some sites even kept a small cask on the scaffold for washing hands, before handling the face stones, because greasy fingerprints are forever, even if they're from goose fat and a good intention. Halfway through the afternoon, a cart arrives with a proper coopered barrel lashed on top, and little taps like dimples near the bottom. You admire it the way a traveller admires a good bridge. Suddenly the journey has fewer arguments. The barrel turns each trip into many buckets, and the cart's driver, who has the confident air of a person whose horse likes him, positions the spout close to the mixing trough, saving you 20 steps per refill. Someone quietly places a flower on the cart's shaft as if blessing a saint. Efficiency makes everyone sentimental. A small debate bubbles up as a cloud slides over the sun and the air goes from warm to woolly. Should you pull from the well now that the stream looks a little high and brown after the distant rain? The master considers water clarity versus distance. The mortarmen weigh texture. The steward squints at the sky as if the sky has a ledger. Decision use the well for surface water and the stream in small, careful draws for the slake pit heat. There will discipline the silt. You nod along, glad someone else is paid to think, while you are paid in bread and beer mostly to carry. And yes, that is your 1.5 jokes for the hour. A final quirky note lands at your feet like a polite frog, when the buckets come home scuffed and the yoke has bitten one shoulder more than the other. You rub the wood with a little beeswax and a pinch of ash. It makes the surface friendlier and your shirt last longer. The trick came from the bowyer, who treats yokes like gigantic bows for very slow arrows. He's not wrong. Every trip is a shot at the heart of the wall. The day leans toward the golden time. The river slides under the willow's fringe, whispering to itself like an old storyteller who forgot the punchline but enjoys the sound of the setup. You finish a run, hang the buckets on their pegs, and roll your shoulders until one of them cracks like a knuckle and then forgives you. Across the yard, the scaffold breathes, the mortar gleams, and the gatehouse frames, you noticed earlier, have developed new opinions and a taller posture. You take a sip from the skin, swish it over tongue and teeth, and feel the cool slide all the way down like silk. Then from the tower, whose stones are just beginning to learn what height feels like, the bell speaks clear, round, inevitable. It doesn't shout, it arranges. The tone reaches into the bucket line, into the quarry path, into the timber yard, and puts each of you where the hour needs you to be. You lift your head, share a half smile with the neighbour who knows exactly what that sound means, and set the yoke down with a soft clack on the peg. The day is about to change shape, not faster, just different, the way a song moves from verse to chorus without raising its voice. The bell calls you to the next duty, and it will organise your whole night if you let it. The bell still lingers in your ears, a round bronze note stretched thin by the breeze, and as its echo folds itself into silence, you feel the whole worksite change key. Stone hauling quiets, mortar stirring slows. Even the water carriers lower their buckets, as if the sound had tapped them gently on the shoulder. Because now it isn't just labour, it's rhythm. The wall no longer grows in random fits. It swells and shrinks according to the tolls of that bell, a conductor with no hands and no baton, only a voice that the village cannot ignore. You shift your weight on the plank, glance up at the tower, and see the bell's mouth glinting faintly in the light. It's not just a timepiece, though it does tell the hours the way a careful old woman counts stitches. It's also a heartbeat for your day, dividing the flow of work into pulses. The morning call means quarry crews change shifts. The midday strike means hands wash and spoons appear. The long dusk toll means torches and watchmen. Every clang is an invisible shepherd's crook tugging the flock of you from one field of duty to the next. A mainstream fact that keeps you tethered. Bells in medieval Europe were far more than musical interruptions. They marked canonical hours, prime, terce, sext, none, liturgical time translated into civic rhythm. Monastic houses rang them, parish churches echoed them, whole towns became braided into a schedule measured not in minutes but in notes. Builders depended on them too. Records survive of town ordinances specifying that construction work could start at first bell and must stop at last, lest neighbours complain about noise or dust after dark. The bell was the worker's contract ringing as both whip and lullaby. You feel that contract in your bones. The bell rings. Terse mid-morning and suddenly scaffolds come alive. Masons shout for fresh mortar. Timber crews hand up braces. Children dart through with baskets of wedges and pegs. Your neighbour grins, sets down a bucket and mutters, "We move when it sings." And indeed you do. A quirky tidbit floats into memory. Some villages named their bells as if they were people Mary Good Thomas Sweetvoice. They baptized them with wine or holy water, convinced the sound itself could chase away storms or plague. One chronicle insists that a certain bell rang on its own whenever enemies approached, like a very loud, very reliable watchdog. You can't prove that today, but you admit there's something uncanny about how the bell always seems to know when your back is begging for a pause. Work resumes under its cadence. You mix mortar to the slow beat of its vibration still echoing in your ears. You haul a stone, and without realizing time, your breaths to the ghost of the note in on the hum out on the silence. It's not unlike walking to music only you can hear. At one point you catch yourself humming with it, a droning tune that carries you across the yard more easily than bare effort. Several others hum too, and suddenly the yard feels less like a labour camp and more like a sleepy choir that just happens to be carrying rocks. Historians still argue about just how strict these bells were. Some claim the bell's hours were inflexible, law work began and ended with its iron tongue, no exceptions. Others suggest bells were gentler guides tolerated when convenient and ignored when the wall demanded overtime. Archaeological layers of hastily laid courses hint at frantic evenings when daylight was hoarded bell or no bell. The truth may live somewhere between bells as polite reminders, but hunger weather and lords' tempers often deciding who actually listened. You pause, lean on the shovel, and notice how the bell weaves together more than schedules. It's also gossip. Each toll is an announcement: births, funerals, fires, musters. When it rang oddly at noon last summer, everyone dropped their tools and ran, because bells don't lie without reason. Today, it rings as expected, and the calm that spreads across the yard is as nourishing as bread. Even donkeys flick their ears in time, as if they too find comfort in being told what hour it is. Modern aside whispered into your own sleeve, this is workplace slack centuries early. Instead of push notifications on a screen, you get push notifications in the sky. And unlike Slack, the bell can't be muted, which depending on your mood is either terrible or genius. You notice something else: the subtle choreography bells enforce. The quarry stops long enough for carts to return safely without clogging the road. The mortar line adjusts so fresh paste arrives before the troughs turn crusty. The water brigade breathes together, buckets raised in synchrony like a strange liturgical dance. It's accidental efficiency, a productivity hack blessed by bronze. If the bell didn't exist, someone would have had to invent it, and you suspect they would have anyway, because villagers dislike chaos almost as much as they dislike empty ale casks. A neighbour jokes that the bell has better timing than half the workforce. You laugh, but also admit it's true. Some people listen more faithfully to bells than to stewards. You even hear stories of masons arguing. The bell said it's time to stop, as if the bell itself were the ultimate authority higher than lords. And in a way it is. A wall may rise from stone, but the rhythm that lets it rise comes from sound. The wind carries the after-ring into your hair, a faint tremor you imagine you could comb with your fingers. You feel your shoulders unclench slightly, and your breath finds a slower pattern. The bell has that effect. It doesn't just schedule, it soothes. You can almost sleep standing up, rocking slightly to the residual hum. But then another command reaches your ears, this one less melodic, a foreman calling for the children's help. The bell may have organized the adults, but the children surprisingly organize the tools. And they are already scampering little shadows between scaffolds, weaving the next rhythm into the day. And so you set aside your shovel smile at the thought of young hands keeping the whole wall alive and lean into the next verse of the work song. Because the bell has spoken, and the wall must listen. The bell's echo fades into the rafters of the half-built gatehouse, and almost on cue, a different sound takes over: the patter of small feet on packed earth, the chatter of thin voices, and the clatter of tools far too big for the hands holding them. You look down from your plank and realize the day has shifted into a new gear. The children have arrived. They aren't apprentices yet, not sworn to any trade, but they are bodies, energy, and enthusiasm. 3 ingredients every wall secretly requires. You smile despite yourself, because in a world where everyone works, even the smallest shoulders end up carrying some part of the stone. At first glance, it looks like chaos. One boy runs off with a wooden mallet, twice the length of his forearm. A girl totters by with a basket of wedges, gripping it as if it's filled with gold. Two little ones drag a rope that is clearly tied to nothing but each other's determination. Yet in that clamour, there is a pattern. Someone calls for a chisel, and a child sprints to fetch it. Another points out that the water trough is almost empty, and soon two pairs of tiny arms are wrestling with a bucket, splashing more water on themselves than in the mortar, but still somehow delivering enough. A mainstream fact to ground the picture in medieval villages: children were not hidden from labour. From as early as 6 or 7 they helped wherever hands were needed, tending animals, spinning wool, chasing birds from grain, or in this case carrying small loads on construction sites. They were not masons, not yet, but they became the living threads that stitched tasks together. A 10-year-old might hold the trowel for a father, steady a ladder, or run errands between scaffolding bays. It was how learning happened, by shadowing, by carrying, by watching stone rise one joint at a time until the rhythm was part of their bones. You watch a group of them form their own brigade, handing up pegs for scaffolding braces. Their laughter spills into the worksite lighter than the grunts of the quarrymen, and it lifts the entire mood like a candle in a cellar. One boy makes a trumpet out of a hollow reed and blasts a squeaky fanfare every time a beam is set in place. Another pretends to command the donkeys, though the donkeys clearly command themselves. Everyone pretends not to notice, because joy, even in disguise, is a valuable material for building walls. Quirky tidbit worth remembering in some chronicles: children at castle sites were tasked with singing to keep the rhythm for mortar mixing teams. A row of boys or girls might line up and chant simple rhymes, mix and fold and mix, the way a drummer keeps pace for oarsmen. Some accounts even mention children tasked with chasing shadows, literally marking when the sun reached certain points, so the masons could measure hours. They became tiny timekeepers, apprentice sundials with legs. You kneel to tie off a rope and two small faces peer over your shoulder. Why twist it that way, one asks, eyes wide with the impatience of wanting to know everything at once. You explain about tension, about how ropes bite into wood when crossed. The child nods solemnly, though you can tell they are mostly impressed that the knot looks like a rabbit's ears. Another pipes up. Can I try? And before you know it, your neat bundle of lashings has become a child's playground. But you let them, because better to learn on a rope than on a falling beam. Historians still debate just how integrated children were in construction labour. Some scholars argue their role was minimal, that the dangers of falling stone and quicklime kept them mostly away. Others suggest they were ever present, filling the countless small gaps in the labour chain. Documentary silence makes it hard to know. But oral tradition songs, folk tales, jokes suggest children were indeed there, learning and helping. The very phrase, boys' work or girls' work, survives in accounts of guild training. Perhaps not hauling great blocks, but carrying chisels, water pegs, even messages, those small errands without which great errands collapse. You notice the way their songs mingle with the bell's old echo. A girl sings a nonsense verse about geese sitting on the wall. Everyone laughs, because a goose does indeed wander through the sight, honking as if auditioning for a supervisory role. Someone chases it. Someone else joins in, and suddenly 3 children are sprinting after one indignant bird, while adults pretend to scold, but are secretly entertained. Goose chasing is not on the work order, but it is very much part of the work. A modern aside sneaks into your head. This is daycare, except the playground is scaffolding. The toys are chisels, and the only safety measure is try not to fall. Imagine telling a modern inspector that the preschool program includes mortar stirring and donkey wrangling. You'd be arrested. Here, though, it's education, and strangely it works. Another quirky observation: one child, clearly the joker of the group, pretends to fall asleep on a pile of ropes, snoring loudly, until a mason picks him up like a sack and deposits him in the shade. Everyone chuckles. Later, that same child will probably be the first to climb the scaffold with nimble toes, eager to show he can be useful. The cycle is predictable: play, learn, repeat. You can see apprenticeships being born right in front of you, in the muddy footprints of children who are half workers, half jesters, and entirely essential. The wind picks up, carrying the sound of their laughter across the yard. For a moment, the worksite feels less like a battlefield in preparation and more like a festival in progress. It reminds you that walls are not just barriers, they're also classrooms, playgrounds, and training grounds. Every small hand that touches a stone today will remember the texture tomorrow, and someday those hands will be big enough to set stones themselves. Still, you can't help but notice how precarious it is. A boy darts too close to a donkey's flank, a girl climbs one rung higher than she should, and every adult eye swivels nervously. You mutter a prayer, not grand, just a whisper to the wind that the wall will teach without punishing. Because the children are not just helpers, they are also the wall's future, the masons and carriers of tomorrow. And as you watch them scatter, giggling and stumbling, one thought presses at the edge of your mind: laughter makes the wall rise faster, but night comes quickly, and laughter does not light torches. The next duty belongs to meals, to feeding the bellies that fuel the wall. And that duty will gather everyone, children included, around pots and planks and the promise of stew. You smell lunch before you see it, the thick, friendly perfume of barley giving up its starch onions, turning sweet, and a little trail of smoke that has learned to behave in the afternoon air. The worksite, which has spent the morning sounding like iron and stone arguing with wood, suddenly begins to purr like a giant cat, finding the warm square of sun on a kitchen floor. You follow your nose past the mortar beds and the stacked poles, past a donkey doing its best impression of a food critic, and into a clearing where the village has pulled the hearth closer to the wall so the wall can eat too. A cauldron the size of a family story hangs from an iron trammel above a hearth ringed with fieldstones. Its surface breathes in slow bubbles, each one a round syllable of comfort. You kneel to feed the fire with fistfuls of twig and splinters trimmed from scaffold poles. The flames accept the offering with a crisp whisper, then settle to a low, even crackle. The smoke is cooperative today. Tired of being dramatic, it rises politely, threads itself into the higher air, and drifts toward the half-built parapet, as if offering the stones a taste. The mood shifts with the scent. Work voices soften. The rhythm of the place changes key. You fetch your wooden bowl, scarred, familiar, the rim worn smooth by generations of lips, and your spoon, which is arguably your most personal possession after your boots. You slip into a line that doesn't feel like a line, so much as a tide. Everyone is here in some orbit, masons with lime freckles, timber crews still perfumed by resin, water carriers with damp hems, wide-eyed children listing all the things they did today in a single breath. The stew welcomes you with a polite plop, and steam kisses your face like a grandmother who has never once forgotten your birthday. Mainstream fact to anchor your appetite for villages raising walls: midday meals were practical, communal, and calorically ambitious. Pottage grains simmered with vegetables, and whatever protein the day could afford was the backbone ladled into bowls from a shared pot set up near the job. Bread was omnipresent, rough loaves with good crusts that could survive a morning in a satchel. Small beer or ale was normal at strengths that refreshed rather than rearranged the worksite most of the time. In some towns, the lord or city paid for livery bread and ale as part of the building obligation. In others, households contributed ingredients and cooks rotated duty, so the cauldron never learned the meaning of the word empty. You taste and feel the day loosen a notch. The barley is cooperative, the onions are telling jokes, and the sprig of thyme someone threw in at the last second is punching above its weight. You blow on your spoon and watch the steam curl and vanish, which is almost as soothing as eating. A neighbour breaks a loaf and passes you the heel, the most poetic piece of bread, because it carries both crust and softness. You thank them with the silent nod people use when their mouths are busy doing the important work of being happy. A quirky tidbit to set next to your bowl trenchers: thick slabs of stale bread, often doubled as plates in wealthier settings, but even at work sites, someone might lay slices on a plank, so fatty bits could kiss the bread and turn it into a second course. And the spoon etiquette is its own tiny kingdom. You keep yours tied on a thong at your belt, more loyal than a purse, less likely to wander than a borrowed knife. One elderly mason has been carving the same spoon for years. It is now white with age and burnished like a seashell. He swears it makes pottage taste like Sundays. No one argues. He has more wrinkles than the church door has stories. You let the stew sit in your belly and radiate. Around you, the soundscape changes from clinks and thuds to small domestic noises, a whetstone sighing along a chisel, the pop of a knot surrendering in the fire, the hush of cloth as someone wipes mortar from their hands. Children orbit the cauldron like planets that smell trouble, and also soup. One dips a crust too enthusiastically and invents a new art form called splash painting. The cook, a woman with arms like confidence, gives a look that could curdle milk, and at once the children adopt perfect posture and pretend to be saints carved in oak. It lasts 4 seconds, maybe 5. You take a pull of small ale from a shared jug and feel the refreshing almost absence of fear. Modern aside, this is the world's gentlest energy drink, bubbles a little grain, and the promise that you won't do anything you'll regret on a ladder. Water is fine today, thanks to the stream and the well, but ale is safe in a way that makes grandmothers exhale when they see you drink it. The jug goes around careful hands, the little ritual of wipe and pass, and you marvel at how sharing can be both automatic and sacred with nothing more than a cloth and a moment of eye contact. Historians still argue about the exact nutrition of medieval work crews. Were calories sufficient for heavy labour? Did fasting days at religious times undercut productivity? Or did communities quietly bend rules for necessary works? Some guild records suggest allowances of bread and ale that would make a modern dietitian sit down abruptly. Other accounts hint at leaner weeks where pottage knew more cabbage than kindness. There's also debate over how often meat showed up in the pot pork odds and ends, salted fish on Fridays, the occasional rabbit if speed met inexperience. The archaeological record bones charred seeds, residues on pottery whispers many answers, and you suspect the truth shifts with season and purse. What you know is simple: when the stew is good, the wall rises happier. Someone slices onions for tomorrow, and the air begins to sparkle with that particular perfume that is half tear, half promise. A child brings a handful of chives like flowers, and the cook gives them a coin and a kiss on the hairline, which is either payroll or affection or both. Another child, bold and tiny, sits on the ground and guards the salt like a dragon in a story. Salt is precious. It has to be parcelled politely. The village remembers winters where salt ran shy and everybody learned to love blandness. Today is not one of those. You pass the pinch with the calibrated generosity of a treasurer handing out gold dust. A friend leans on a timber and tells a story about a fortress feast when a new gate was raised, a wheel of cheese so big 2 men rolled it like a barrel of pie whose lid could shelter a family, and a cup passed so ceremoniously that everyone forgot who owned it. Whether that happened here or in the friend's imagination is not the point. The point is that food makes the idea of walls feel less like severity and more like cooperation you can taste. The wall will keep people safe. The cauldron keeps people kind. Your jokes today arrive like crumbs on a napkin. First, you look into the cauldron and say it's the best architect on site because it turns ingredients into structure. Laughter, a small chorus. Second, you pat your belly and announce you're adding insulation to your personal keep. Groans, but friendly ones. Third, you promise yourself to stop at 3. You tell the donkey the stew is vegetarian, so it is in no danger whatsoever. The donkey flicks an ear and stares as if it understands both the word and the joke, and is tired of being typecast. As you sop the last gloss of broth with bread, a breeze curls across the yard and brings a new smell rope tar, sun-warmed wood, the high, thin tang of fresh-cut pegs. You look up and see the scaffold bays rising another ledger beam higher. The planks flex in the wind like calm water under footsteps. Up there, lunch is a different sport, a chunk of bread, a strip of cheese, a careful chew with legs braced wide and eyes half-lidded against the sun. Some say food tastes better with altitude. You say it tastes more deliberate. Every bite taken halfway to the sky feels like a promise to finish what you started. Before you stand, you let yourself drift for 1 small minute. The world narrows to the slow pulse of the fire, the way smoke threads itself into the blue, the silky weight of fullness settling under your ribs, the distant clack of a chisel that couldn't bear to stop for long. Your eyelids get pleasantly heavy and you consider the noble art of the 5-breath nap. You take 4 of them and smile at the audacity of your own restraint. Time to rise. Bowls get rinsed with a ladle of water wiped with clean grass hung on pegs that look like a row of little noses. The cauldron is fed for its afternoon encore. The children scatter recalibrated by soup. You hand the cook your thanks in the currency that spends everywhere a sincere look and a promise to carry wood tomorrow. The cook nods, already stirring, already thinking 2 meals ahead because walls run on mortar and meals in equal measure. You dust your hands, shoulder your tool, and step back toward the skeleton of ladders and braces. Above you the planks murmur, the ropes creak with the comfortable language of good tension. The wind scribbles messages along the parapet to be. Lunch has made you slower in the nicest possible way. Feet-sure thoughts, soft breath even. Which is good because the next duty demands steady feet and a listening body. You're going up where the scaffold sings and the breeze has opinions, and where a simple step can be the difference between rhythm and reminder. The wall is calling you higher, and it will test your balance with every whisper of wind. You plant your boot on the first rung and feel the scaffold speak to you, not in words exactly, but in little wooden vowels, a creak here, a hush there, a tiny throat clearing where a brace meets a post. The wind curls around the frame with the nose of a curious dog, sniffing the knots, teasing the edges of planks, testing what today's ambition weighs. You wrap your fingers around a hemp rope, slick with tar and sweat, and the smell rises warm, resinous, a little like shipyards and old stories. Below the lunch fire mutters to itself. Above the sky expands until the village looks like a careful toy someone set out on a rug of fields. You climb. The scaffold is a forest remade into grammar. Uprights stand in tamped earth like sentences with their punctuation hammered in. Ledgers run across conjugating weight. Braces cut diagonals through the air, crisp, decisive, persuasive. Every connection is a promise. Rope crossing rope at a clean angle, a peg driven to a modest pride. A putlog beam slid into a square hole left in the wall expressly for that handshake between wood and stone. You test the first plank with your heel, then your whole foot. The plank answers with a soft, yes, not loud, not shy, exactly the tone you want from something that will be holding you while the wind thinks of hobbies. A mainstream fact to steady your breath: medieval scaffolding for masonry generally relied on roundwood poles lashed with rope or fixed with wooden pegs, the platform supported by putlogs set into those neat square holes you still see in old walls. The system was sectional and mobile, lifted a course at a time as the wall grew like a spiral staircase that keeps adding steps just ahead of your feet. Ledgers tied bays together. Braces kept the hold from learning how to sway like a sailor on leave. Planks were laid side by side sometimes with a small lip or a toe board to discourage tools from auditioning for flying careers. When the work finished, many putlog holes were filled. Others remained little fossils of construction visible to anyone who knows where to look. You ease onto the first platform, knees, soft spine, listening. The wind pushes, then remembers its manners and steps back. Far below, a donkey sneezes, which you decide is either encouragement or commentary on plank placement. A neighbour joins you. The plank dips, then settles to a new truth. Together, you become a small temporary choir, your boots, the braces, the steady song of a trowel cutting mortar, the occasional clink of a chisel, setting a recalcitrant stone. It is surprisingly soothing at height. The world widens, yes, but your attention narrows to exactly where your toes end and tomorrow begins. Quirky tidbit to carry like a charm: some crews rubbed beeswax along rope crossings before cinching the lashing to make the knot remember, as an old carpenter says. Others tucked a sprig of yew or rowan into the first bay, raised each morning a tiny superstition against splintered news. And at least one mason you know swears by naming the planks the first time you step on them, calling out "Steady Judith," "Kind Martin, don't be silly Peter," because it is harder for a plank to misbehave once it has a reputation. You do it under your breath now, and the plank, flattered, behaves. The higher you go, the more the wind practices its scales. It runs a fingertip along the edge of a banner someone foolishly left tied to a brace, and the cloth adds a soft hiss to the day. You widen your stance when the breeze stiffens and place each foot down as if you were setting a cup on a shelf you love. Across the bay, a young mason hums a tune that takes the edge off the gusts. The notes drift like lazy swallows perching on ledger beams before flying on. You catch yourself humming to a low C sound in your throat, and the platform feels less like a challenge and more like a porch. Historians still argue about the engineering sophistication of these frames. Some see in the regular ghost holes and surviving sketches a careful, almost standardized system angles calculated by habit, if not by math. Lashings laid in set patterns, load paths understood like recipes. Others insist on improvisation villages, reusing timber from earlier works, bracing bays by eye and lesson rather than rule making do with whatever the coppice offered this spring. You live in the overlap, a grammar you can trust, a poem you revise every afternoon when the wind changes its mind. You shuffle a plank forward, one of those quiet miracles that looks like nothing and means everything. Slide lift set. The board's ends find fresh support. You kneel to check the lashing cross frap cinch. The rope's fibers hum under your fingers like a bee with good news. A joke sneaks out without asking permission. You tell your neighbor you're installing a luxury balcony. He snorts. Where's the view? You gesture grandly at a horizon of hedges and sheep. 5-star rural minimalist. Laughter makes the bay feel warmer. Below, the mortar crew sings their mixing chant, fold and stir, stir and fold, and the rhythm climbs the uprights like ivy. A child peeks through the lattice from the ground and waves as if you're a famous acrobat. You wave back with the solemnity of someone pretending not to be flattered. Your hands remember the roughness of the rope, your soles the grain of the plank, your back the way to keep its own weather-friendly. The sensory world is a careful map, tar and oak and lime and breath. You could navigate blind, though you absolutely will not. A second joke arrives because the wind asked for it. When a gust shoves your shoulder, you say, "Easy there, one at a time, we're fully booked." The wind, which loves polite boundaries, relaxes to a civilized breeze. You edge along the wall to where a gap wants a stone. You signal down, and a block rises on a rope sling from the ground, spinning slowly, as if trying to remember a dance it learned last winter. You catch it with your palm, guide it to stillness, and feel the weight arrive in your bones, and then go quiet in your hands. The sling creaks pleasantly, the peg on the ledger holds. The knot looks you in the eye and swears it will not fail today. You butter the bed with mortar, a generous smear, like frosting a cake for a saint who dislikes wobbles, and then twist the block into place with a small grind that ends in satisfaction. The wall accepts the gift. You smooth the joint, strike the face, and the wind successful critic that it is approves by going silent for exactly 3 heartbeats. A small, sharp reminder: safety is a practice, not a charm. You keep your toes 2 fingers from the plank's edge. You never stand under a lifted stone. You speak before you move, so the bay knows you're part of it. When a plank shows a crack wide enough to hold a thought, you retire it politely and cut a shorter job where the span is kinder. The scaffold rewards this courtesy by being the kind of friend who tells you when you have spinach in your teeth, one tiny squeak, one different shudder, and you listen. Another debate to tuck into your belt: did builders use guardrails consistently? Some depictions show them. Others show bare edges and nerves of braided steel, or perhaps just fewer illustrated lawyers. Archaeology preserves holes and stains, not railings, so certainty is scarce. Your village uses toe boards and occasional waist rails when the height or the wind is feeling theatrical. You also employ the oldest safety device in the world, someone shouting, "Mind," with enough conviction to make a mule reconsider its life choices. The sun moves, the shadow of the wall creeps across the yard like a thoughtful animal, and your bay rises with it, new ledgers, fresh braces, a ladder repositioned with a grunt and a laugh. You feel a private pride at the small economies you invent, tucking a spare wedge under a tie where you'll need it later, laying the planks with their crown up so water will not loiter, brushing grit off a bed, so the new course sits like it was always meant to be there. Small courtesies to future you. Future you is grateful and sends a note probably carried by the wind. Third joke to honor the personal rule you pretend exists. You pat the wall and say, "Stand up straight. Company's coming." Your neighbor pats it too. We are the company. The wall, flattered again, looks higher. On the far corner, a brace complains in a voice you don't love. You and the carpenter lean into it, loosen reseat, relash, add a sister brace that crosses the first like a well-considered argument. The next gust tests the repair and gets bored quickly. You exhale slow, steady, and taste the day on your tongue lime salt, a dusting of barley you're sure you rinsed away. The plank beneath your knees has warmed to your weight. It feels almost friendly. When you finally pause, hands on thighs, breath settling, the village below looks softer than it did from the ground. Smoke from the cook fire has thinned to a silver line. The quarry road is a brown thread with bright beads, where carts blink in and out of sunlight under hedges. The well glitters like a coin someone flicked into a story. You realize that from up here you can read the whole day at once: stone, timber, water, mortar song. The wall is an instrument, and the scaffold is the bow that draws sound from it. But there's a limit to daylight's patience. Shadows lengthen, the wind cools, and somewhere behind the ridge the sun begins writing its polite resignation letter to the afternoon. You ride the ladder down with the careful joy of someone who has stayed upright all day, and your boots meet the ground like old friends. Tools get stacked, ropes coiled, lashings checked for tomorrow. And then, because the bell promises it every evening, another rhythm takes the stage. Torches will bloom. The half-built crown of the wall will become a line of small stars. Footsteps will slow to a hush that listens. Night watch begins quiet work with wide eyes and duties that are gentler and stranger than you expect. Dusk folds itself along the wall like a cloak being tried on for the first time, and you feel the temperature tilt, warm breath traded for cool edges, gold light thinning to pewter the smells of lime and sap, replaced by damp earth, old stone, and the faint sweetness of crushed grass under boots. You are tired in the slow, honest way that makes a bed sound like a promise, but the village has another appointment with the wall before dreams are allowed. Night watch begins. Even half-built, the wall expects eyes, ears, and a certain courteous paranoia. You take up a lantern with ribs of iron and a belly of horn, feel its heat brush your knuckles and climb. Up on the parapet to be, the world rearranges itself into fewer colours and more sounds. The wind remembers your name, but whispers it now. An owl writes its round punctuation mark somewhere beyond the hedgerow. The stream below stops pretending to be a workplace utensil and goes back to being a stream saying old water words to itself in the dark. Far across the fields, a dog gives one measured bark and then reconsiders drama. The bell does not ring. Its job is done for the day. In its place come smaller voices, footsteps on planks, the click of a lanthorn shutter, the muttered inventory of a watchman counting his way through the night, flint steel horn-cord cloak. Mainstream fact: to settle your lantern-hand medieval towns across Europe kept watch and ward by custom and by law, even during construction seasons. In England, after the Statute of Winchester, 1285, households in walled towns were obliged to furnish men for the night watch, to challenge strangers after curfew, and to raise hue and cry if trouble came. Elsewhere, parish watchmen paced streets, castle warders kept the rounds along battlements, and curfew bells marked the moment when fires should be banked and doors should think about being doors. A wall in progress did not excuse vigilance. If anything, half-height stones and scaffolds asked for more of it. Too easy to climb, too tempting to meddle with, too full of tools that look like silver to a desperate hand. You settle into the first circuit along the walk, where planks end in the polite lip of a toe-board, past a ladder, tied off with a knot you personally trust, by a stack of stones tucked under a damp cloth to keep the faces from chipping in the cool. The lantern's light is soft and buttery, not a spotlight, but a suggestion. It prefers to tell you that things are there without explaining them fully, like a storyteller who wants you to lean closer. You breathe in time with its flicker, slow, deliberate, and you let the night shape your attention into a cup that catches small sounds. A quirky tidbit sidles up in the dark. Some places arm the watch with wooden clappers, a pair of hinged boards that rattle with a dry, percussive scold, used to alarm neighbours without throwing sparks. Others kept a bucket of sand and a rake on every landing, because the most common nighttime enemy wasn't a raider at all, but a spark in a thatched roof. More than one chronicle praises the brisk night boy who spotted an ember strolling where it had no right, and combed it out with a wooden rake, saving half a street with the gentlest firefight imaginable. Tonight you have your own little sand gourd at your belt, a comfort you pat like a sleeping cat. You pause at the gate mouth, where carpenters spent the afternoon preening beams. The shadows there are confident. They can afford to be. You test the new pin with your thumb, feel the proud fit, and nod to yourself, as if the wood needs encouragement to keep being wood. A gust explores the mouth and nudges your cloak. The lantern answers with a quick brightening, then calms. You listen to the emptiness and realize it is not empty, just full of things that behave. A moth taps the horn pane like a tiny knuckle. A spider rehearses an ambitious bridge between two pegs. Your breath condenses and drifts away like secret speech. Historians still argue about how formal the night watch really was on wallworks like yours. Some read civic records and hear crisp orders. Countersigns set routes, fixed hours. Fines for sleeping on duty, horn calls for fire or foe. Others look at parish accounts and see something more elastic: neighbours taking turns, routines woven around harvests and saints' days, a watch that was competent because it was communal, not because it was militarised. The truth, as your feet discover on the Second Circuit, probably wore both faces. You have a password tonight. The reeve made it a fruit again, so nobody forgets. And you also have an understanding that if your neighbour's snore gets too poetic, you will nudge them gently with the world's most diplomatic boot. On the third pass, you practice the little rituals that turn night into a manageable companion. You shade the lantern with your palm when you peek over the lip so you don't blind your night vision. You tap each lash with the back of your knuckle 3 quick notes to be sure the rope hasn't loosened in the cool. You lay a spare wedge exactly where you wished one had been yesterday. You tighten your cloak and discover that wool has a way of becoming warmer when you remember to thank it. The wind gathers itself for a more serious opinion, then diffuses into the open fields as if it forgot what it was going to say. Modern aside hushed, so the stars don't roll their eyes. This is Security Patrol meets Meditation app. Your steps are the metronome. Your breath is the guided voice. The premium feature is not falling off the wall. You consider charging yourself a subscription and decide the monthly fee will be a hot drink at midnight. Down below, shadows shift at the edge of the yard, and you still letting silence fatten around the sound until it reveals its shape. Not men. Deer. They flow through the hedge with the same casual authority sheep have in daylight, and you have to laugh quietly at the memory of yesterday's panic when a child reported horned raiders, and the entire watch discovered the enemy was a gang of extremely disrespectful goats. You raise the lantern just enough to pencil a soft line of light, and the deer, unimpressed by architecture, go about their business of being deer. You share the watch with others in a chain that's more friendship than schedule. A woman from the weaving lane takes the west run. An elderly mason who swears he sleeps better after a small stroll with responsibilities wanders the inner yard. 2 lads swap jokes under their breath at the north corner and pace like planet moons. Every so often, someone murmurs the countersign as you meet at a ladderhead plum. Pudding. And the shared silliness keeps you awake far better than solemnity could. This is not a battlefield. It is a bedside vigil held for a patient that happens to be made of stone and wood. Another mainstream detail, because knowledge is a good hand-warmer curfew, wasn't only about putting out lights. It was about shifting the town from market to hush. Inns banked their fires. Doors were barred. Travellers caught outside were expected to find shelter or face questions from the watch. On building sites, tools were counted and locked in chests. Lime pits were covered so no one stumbled into a bad chemistry lesson. Ladders were lowered or tied so that the wall would not offer stairs to any curious moonlit opportunist. You help with that, drag a ladder 2 rungs down, re-hitch the knot, check the chest's hasp with a tug that means sleep now. Your jokes tonight are small, respectful, the kind of jokes that bow before they speak. First, you pat a merlin stub and whisper, "If you see anything suspicious, blink twice." The stone professional to a fault does not blink. Second, you thank the moon for the free lantern upgrade. The moon, doing a decent impression of a polished shield, pretends it already knows it is helpful. Third, because a rule is a rule, you tell your neighbor you're filing for overtime in yawns. He pays you immediately with one of his own. Somewhere around what you guess is midnight, the lantern burned its first bite of rush and is looking forward to the second. The sky thins into a deeper black, the kind that allows more stars through. Your eyelids practice slow blinks. Your boots practice standing still without scolding your legs. You pull your cloak tighter and think of bed's straw ticking and wool, the soft argument it makes under the weight of a day. You could sleep right here on the plank if someone promised to hold the wind. And sometimes people do. There is an old pallet tucked into a dry corner where those on last watch take little careful naps measured in the length of a candle's ring of melted wax. It is not glamorous, but it is sufficient, like most things that actually work. The last circuit reminds you why you came up, not romance, not even duty exactly, but a quieter thing. Companionship with the village while it sleeps. You listen for trouble, and mostly find peace. You listen for thieves and find cats. You listen for enemies, and hear the small negotiations of beams and braces cooling for morning. When you finally hand off the horn and the lantern to the next watch, your shoulders drop the way ropes do when the load is set down right. You descend the ladder with knees that have earned their opinions. The ground feels wider. The night feels like it belongs to you a little. And just as you reach the yard, a hush opens to let a new smell through tar warming by the embers hemp rope, and the faint sharp breath of iron that's been filed, honed and made ready. Because while half the village kept the dark polite, the other half has been preparing the wall's vocabulary for tomorrow: pegs, pins, nails, wedges, hoops, hinges. The daybreak duty won't be stone or song or stew. It will be a conversation with tools and with the people whose hands turn raw stock into the little miracles that keep everything from wobbling. The next duty hums in the black like a file on fresh steel, and it is closer than you think. Morning returns in pieces first, the grey light rinsing the sky, then the cough of someone raking yesterday's ashes, then the rooster who thinks punctuality is a performance art. Your own body is slower, every joint whispering its opinion, but the wall doesn't wait for poetry. By the time you shuffle to the yard, a different kind of orchestra is tuning up. Not stone, not mortar, but the bright metallic rasp of files on iron. The toolmakers are awake, and the day smells not of stew or timber, but of hot, tar-ground metal, and the faint sweetness of wood shavings curled like little sleeping snails. Spread before you is a table, or rather a plank stretched across barrels covered in the half-familiar shapes of work chisels, with faces blunted by yesterday's enthusiasm, hammers with heads that wobble on their hafts, like loose teeth pegs waiting to be trimmed to size ropes that have been kissed by too much weather, and now sulk in frayed silence. Beside them lie newer marvels, hoops for scaffolding barrels, nails black from the forge hinges, and dogs for the gatehouse clamps whose jaws still taste of fire. You realize that today your job is less brawn and more conversation, listening to tools explain what they need in order to keep the wall honest. A mainstream fact to set the scene: castle and wall building in medieval Europe depended not only on masons and carpenters, but also on the quiet labour of smiths, coopers, rope makers, and wheelwrights. Their work didn't always happen in the limelight, but it was the skeleton under the skeleton. Without sharp chisels, stones stayed rough. Without sound ropes, scaffolds swayed more than anyone liked. Without barrels to carry water, mortar pits dried out like arguments. Records of great building campaigns mention the cost of iron and nails in the same breath as lime and stone, and guild ordinances often dictated that tools had to be inspected and maintained before being trusted for height work. You sit, pick up a chisel, and run your thumb carefully, not on the edge. You're not reckless across the metal's face. It feels tired, rounded like a candle stub. You hand it to the smith, who sets it against the grindstone. The wheel sings as it turns, a slow, watery hiss, and sparks skip away like tiny dancers who only rehearse in the morning. The chisel's face returns sharp, glinting, suddenly confident again. You thank the smith in the local currency, a joke about how his grindstone hums lullabies louder than the bell. He grunts, but you catch the smile hiding in his beard. Quirky tidbits and work crews carried field forges with them, small travelling hearths, where smiths could retemper tools on site. Accounts even mention smiths marching with crusader armies, shoeing horses one moment and sharpening pikes the next, a kind of blacksmith medic hybrid. In peacetime, the wall's forge is quieter, but no less vital. A cracked hammer haft gets sleeved with a wedge of oak and bound with iron. A rope end gets seized with tarred cord to keep it from unravelling like an overlong story. A wheel with a sulking axle receives grease made from tallow and ash, slick and oddly fragrant. Each repair is a miniature act of architecture scaled down from wall to palm. You take your turn at rope splicing. The hemp smells of salt and smoke, as if it remembers the shipyard it was born in. You unlay the strands, tuck them into each other, work them back into a plait, so snug that even the wind cannot persuade them apart. Your fingers learn the rhythm quickly, over-under pull, over-under pull. The new splice bulges slightly, proud of its scar but strong. You test it with your weight and nod as if to say, well mended old friend. A boy watches with eyes wide, then blurts, "It looks like a braid." You grin and answer, "Yes, a braid for giants," and let him try on the smaller cord. His fingers fumble, then succeed, and you can see the seed of a skill planting itself. Historians still argue about tool distribution on sites like these. Some insist tools were owned communally, kept in chests, guarded by stewards signed in and out like sacred relics. Others point to wills and inventories that list personal chisels, hammers, even ladders, evidence that tradesmen clung to their gear like knights to swords. Perhaps the truth sat between masters with their own sets, villagers sharing the common stock, everyone knowing which tools belonged to whom, but pretending they didn't mind borrowing. You glance at your own mallet, its handle polished by your palm, and you suspect you'd notice if it wandered. The morning fills with bright sounds, hammerheads being re-wedged, pegs being whittled to exact thickness files, teaching iron how to behave again. Even the children contribute, carrying bundles of shaved wood for kindling, dipping ropes in tar, so they gleam like licorice. Someone begins a soft song, something about a blacksmith courting a maiden, and it gathers under the noise like a bass line. The rhythm makes the work feel less like maintenance and more like choreography. Modern aside whispered with a smile, "This is tech support for the 12th century. The forge is your hardware desk, the rope maker, your IT guy, the cooper, your logistics team. And like any tech support, they grumble, sigh, then hand you back a tool that works better than you expected. You should really buy them coffee, except here the coffee is small beer and a slab of cheese at noon." Jokes arrive in the smoke. First you pat a freshly sharpened chisel and say, "Ah, a morning person." Second, you watch the rope fray get tarred and declare, "That's the wall's new haircut." Third, when the cooper hammers a hoop onto a barrel and it rings like a bell, you bow and say, "Encore." The cooper pretends not to laugh, but his hammer strikes with suspicious rhythm afterward. The sky climbs from pewter to silver to a blue that almost forgives you. You wipe tar from your fingers on a scrap of cloth that used to be a shirt, flex your hands, and admire the tidy ranks of tools now ready to serve again. There is pride here, not flashy, but calm, the pride of things repaired, not discarded. Every sharpened edge is a promise the wall will keep rising. Every spliced rope is a quiet handshake between today and tomorrow. By mid-morning, the tool bay smells of metal dust and pine resin. Workers reclaim their chisels with affectionate slaps, shoulder their mallets like old friends, and coil ropes with the satisfaction of knowing they won't betray them later. The wall seems to breathe easier too. Its voice will be cleaner, its posture steadier. You feel lighter, not because the work was less, but because it was precise, small acts of mending that ripple outward into safety and height. And then, just as you think about stretching your back and wandering toward the mortar beds, a new noise shuffles in from the periphery. Not clang, not creak, but the quiet hubbub of stalls, unfolding of coins, ringing in pockets of voices that belong not to builders but to traders. The market has decided to set up shop right at the wall's feet, a little city within a city, and with it come shoes, gossip spices, and distractions you didn't know you'd been missing. The next duty is no less communal, but it smells less of tar and more of cinnamon and shoe leather. By the time the forge cools to a purr and the last rope splice dries into confidence, a different current moves through the yard, voices layered like cloth footsteps, with no interest in ladders. The polite clink of coins learning each other's names. You turn, and there it is, a small market blooming right against the wall's knees, as if the village decided that if you won't come to the stalls will happily come to you. A row of trestles springs from nowhere, a cobbler's bench with neat little knives and curls of leather like chocolate shavings, a weaver's board stacked with bands and belts, a peddler's tray of pins, needles, and things so tiny you wonder if they're for people or for very well-dressed mice. The smells rewrite your afternoon tallow and wax-warm leather, a suspiciously optimistic hint of cinnamon, and the air begins to carry the texture of rumour. You wade in half on errand, half in the simple, drowsy pleasure of looking. Your boots scuff ground that's suddenly tidy, as if the earth put on an apron. The cobbler nods, reading your souls with the intimate frankness of a physician, heels going thin. You climb. New lifts. You admit you do, and he pats a box of offcuts, little crescents and moons of leather, and name-drops a price that sounds like a favour. You hand over your boot. He stitches with brisk, precise gestures that feel like a lullaby for tired feet. Around you, voices braid, someone asking for a new knife sheath, someone bargaining for wool caps, a child pleading a case for a whistle carved from elder that to your ear already knows 20 songs. Mainstream fact to anchor your ambling medieval building campaigns often attracted markets, whether formal or informal, where many hands gathered sellers, followed shoes, food tools, ale, even small luxuries like ribbons or combs. In chartered towns, construction hubs stood only a street away from regular market squares, and market days were tied to saints' feasts or weekly cycles. But even villages without charters spun up pop-up economies when large works began. Accounts from cathedral towns itemized costs for nail bundles and cart grease bought at market by the new works. The wall, it turns out, doesn't just eat stone and water, it snacks on commerce. You tinker your way to the spice peddler's stall, a small republic of cloth packets and promises. He lets you sniff at each pennyroyal like green lightning, sage dry and kind, a dusting of cinnamon that pretends to know the road to Jerusalem by heart. He leans in, and with a wink fit for a stage offers sleep herbs for tired masons, meadow-sweet hops, and a pinch of lavender. You think of the night watch and the stubborn rope knots that solved themselves just after midnight, and decide a sachet tucked into your straw tick might be useful. The peddler casually mentions an ointment for mortar hands, beeswax, and goose fat kissed by a whisper of rosemary. You buy that too, because your knuckles remember lime like a long winter. Quirky tidbit worth pocketing: some stalls sell offcuts from unexpected places. The cooper's children hawk thin hoops, shaved from trimmings as bracelets, and who can argue? The bowyer's off-fires short straight lengths, rejected by fussy arrows, become perfect pegs and tent stakes. And the weaver has a line of small padded heel cushions, stitched from scrap linen and sheep's wool expressly for scaffolding feet, a kind of medieval insole that makes you feel briefly like a lord's ankle. She calls them clouds. You slide one into your boot and discover she is not a liar. Historians still argue how commercialized rural life truly was during the high and late Middle Ages. Some paint a picture of vibrant market networks, peddlers circulating coins and fashions even in hamlets, towns pulling villages into weekly purchasing rhythms, builders functioning as cash magnets that accelerated trade. Others remind us that subsistence remained the baseline, that coin was scarce outside chartered centres, that many markets were just neighbours swapping goods with a wink. The truth, like the yard you're standing in, looks mixed cash for specialty items, iron nails, a rare spice, a better knife, barter for everyday needs, eggs for hemp, twine, a mended strap for a jug of ale, and an easy slide between the two. You try on a cap, the wool springy and a bit unruly, and the seller compliments your architect's head, which is a polite way of saying your hair is doing fascinating things. You answer with a grin and a coin. Next door, the rope seller demonstrates a novelty, a thin, tarred line for chalking straight beds. He runs it between two pegs plucks, and a clean black kiss appears across a plank, half music, half geometry. Your inner mason cheers quietly. You buy a reel on the grounds that any tool that sings and draws lines deserves employment. Modern aside, half giggle, half truth. This is your pop-up hardware store, farmer's market, and high-end foot care boutique in one dirt lane, but without the tote bags. Instead, you get a free side of gossip with every purchase. The quarry cart rutted the North Road. The Lord's Reeve has a new hat and a new opinion. Someone's pig thinks it's a dog. You nod sagely, as if all three pieces of intelligence will be vital on the scaffold, and in a way they will. Morale is made of information and small jokes as much as bread. You turn a corner and nearly collide with a table full of needlework, a bright river of belts and sashes embroidered with patterns that look suspiciously like battlements and wave crests. The woman behind the table recognizes your confusion and explains with a smile that has already sold 3 belts today that she and the other women weave gabion skirts. Not actual skirts, but coarse wicker sleeves for earth-filled baskets. The ditches will stack for temporary defences while the stone rises. The smaller ones are good for protecting the base of scaffolds from rolling chips, the larger ones for lining the new moat. She lets you run a finger along a willow rib still green and smelling like a riverbank in spring. The weave is tight, even persuasive. You imagine a line of these skirts absorbing a storm's tantrum or an enemy's rude curiosity. You buy 2 for the scaffold's low corners and tuck them under your arm like folded laundry for a fort. Here's your mainstream detail in that direction. Gabion's wicker cylinders filled with earth or rubble are attested in medieval works, especially where quick field fortification was needed. Whether they were common on village walls or mostly military expedients is debated. What isn't debated is that wickerwork turned a coppiced woodland into instant engineering. Fascines, bundles of brush, stabilized slopes, woven hurdles kept spoil piles from slumping, and wattled shuttering held wet mortar and rubble in shape. Women's weaving knowledge slid from household to fortification with hardly a change in wrist angle, same motion, different stakes. You pause at the ale cart where a brewer with the benevolent air of a favourite aunt pulls a small beer that tastes faintly of bread and politely avoids climbing into your head. She's added a tiny sprig of something floral, for the smell, she says. You notice the bucket of clean water at the cart's foot, a good sign in any century, and the careful way she wipes the lip between sips. She warns you not to linger. The bell will ask you to move before you're ready, and not even a brewer argues with bells. You thank her with a coin, and because you are not made of stone, a compliment about the way her ale has a soft ending. She pretends she hasn't heard that one before. Jokes arrive as naturally as stalls. First you try on a belt and ask if it comes in stone resistant. The seller taps the leather and says, "Only if you avoid stones." Touché. Second you hold up a pair of linen hose and ask whether they make you faster on ladders. The weaver assures you they make you look faster, which is arguably better. Third, you promised yourself 3, you smell the spice tray, and declare I can count the aisles of Jerusalem from here. The peddler announces the price for counting to 10. You decline generously at 5. Coins change hands with the musical tact of pebble on basin, and children discover the peddler who sells penny ribbons and tin whistles shaped like birds. A boy buys a whistle, and then pure mischief uses it to imitate the bell. Everyone groans. The brewer swats him towards some very constructive errand. The market's laughter lifts, then settles like a flock taking off and landing at once. You realize how deeply this helps. A wall can feel like a siege of effort. A market reminds you you're building a place to live in, not just a place to defend. Historians still argue whether markets like this were permitted at works yards or politely shooed to the square. Ordinances often forbid obstruction of streets, but building sites also paid fees for supplies purchased at the very place. Complaints survive about mud churned by carts where bakers' stalls later stood. Praise survives for orderly provision for the workers. You live the contradiction. When the ale cart parks too close to the ladder, it's a nuisance. When the cobbler hands you your mended boot before the bell, it's civilization incarnate. You shoulder your new coil of chalk line, snug your mended boot, tuck the ointment into your belt, and step back to the wall. The market purls on behind you, quiet like a stream, when you're not listening for it. The sky, however, has changed its tone. Clouds earlier just gossip have begun to form committees. A smudge darkens the ridge and sends scouts of cool air over the yard, slipping under your tunic with the practiced fingers of weather. A stall-keeper, old brined with sense, looks up and mutters about the wind's new habit. The bell will not warn you about rain, but the geese will, and the geese are suddenly holding a very urgent meeting. You hand the gabion sleeves to the ditchers, who grin and promise to make them earth-hungry. You coil your chalk line like a small pet snake. You breathe and taste the metallic hint the air gets before storms, as if the sky has been sharpening its own chisels. The market's last purchases flutter down the lane. The brewer caps her cask. The cobbler ties a knot and tucks his awl into his hat like a feather. The afternoon has one more lesson ready. Markets may sweeten a build, but weather directs it. And the weather is clearing its throat politely now, perhaps less politely soon. Better tighten lashings, cover mortar, and call the carts in from the quarry. Because when a storm decides to negotiate with your wall, it always demands the opening bid. You hear them before you see them. The soft jingle of harness rings the clop of hooves measured like a nobleman's handwriting. The discreet cough of a groom who has mastered the art of sounding important without actually saying anything. The air, which a moment ago smelled of wet dust and anxious clouds, takes on new notes, horse-oiled leather, a breath of rosewater trying to negotiate with sweat. You look up from the chalk line you were coiling, and there they are at last, your lord and his small, gleaming comet tail of attendants, stewards with tablets, a clerk with a feather behind his ear, two young squires radiating the profound confidence of people who have never yet lifted anything heavier than a falcon. The storm may be assembling committees on the horizon, but nobility has just convened a meeting in your yard. They are late in the way that only important people can be late, not because they didn't know the hour, but because the hour was clearly shy and needed coaxing. The reeve straightens his hat in self-defense. The master mason wipes his hands on a cloth that has seen too much lime, and half the village unconsciously arranges itself into a tableau that says, "We were absolutely expecting you, and yes, we have been unsurprisingly excellent." You step back, your boots leaving honest wet prints, and you feel the day tilt from work into performance. The Lord reins in near the gate mouth where the carpenters have been preening beams into the idea of a portcullis. He makes the small noise nobles make when they wish to be admired for seeing the obvious. "Good work," he says, which costs him nothing, and buys the yard 2 degrees of warmth. The steward immediately begins to point at things with a tally stick. Stone courses to here, my lord. Scaffold raised another bay. Lime pit covered at dusk. Poot log spacing per master's order. The tally stick, more than any sword, is the true instrument of this visit. It writes the wall in the language of numbers, today's heights. Tomorrow's promises the arithmetic that convinces money to keep believing in stone. Mainstream fact to anchor this little theatre across medieval Europe. Big civic or seigneurial works lived at the intersection of obligation and oversight. Lords claimed labour by corvée in many manners. Towns levied murage tolls specifically granted for wall building in places like England and Wales. Abbots and bishops supervised monastic precinct walls. Counts and castellans toured sites to display authority and, to be fair, occasionally to solve real problems: a quarry road, a new kiln, a loan of oxen. Surviving charters rattle with permissions and exemptions: who owes days at the wall, who pays in coin, instead, which cart may carry timber toll-free on market day. The presence of a lord with his clerk isn't vanity alone. It knits law money and muscle into one afternoon. You watch the clerk unroll a bit of parchment so small it looks like it might be a shopping list: nails shoes for the cart mule, mercy for the reeve's bad handwriting. He scratches a note with a squeak that manages to be both meek and triumphant. The lord gestures toward the storm-thickening ridge and says something about pressing on while the weather indulges us, which is noble, for I will be gone before the rain starts. The master mason smiles the smile of a man who understands meteorology better than Latin declensions and says, "We shall." The wind takes this as its cue to remind everyone which team it is on. Quirky tidbit, because your ears collect them like bright buttons. One of the squires eyes wide at the scaffolding, whispers that he could climb it in a trice, then notices a loose lashing and pivots into a cough so elegant it should be in a tapestry. Another attendant carries a perfumed pomander, as if the wall might have opinions about oranges. Meanwhile, the steward, whose boots are new in a way your souls can smell, steps delicately around a patched puddle and nods gravely, as if he has contributed to the engineering of dry feet. You decide that if the wall needed any more ceremony, it would sprout a choir. Historians still argue about how hands-on nobles were when it came to construction. Some chronicles laud lords who laid the first stone with great piety, or who oft visited the works to encourage speed and excellence. Account rolls, however, sometimes show oversight outsourced to stewards and wardens of the works, with lords making cameo appearances when gifts arrived, or when a new gate required a blessing and a banner. There's a school of thought that sees these visits as pure spectacle, and another that credits them with unlocking resources: a team of oxen, a milling of grain for the crew, a temporary remission of dues so hands could be free. Your eyes accept both spectacle and supply, live in the same saddlebag. The lord dismounts, touches the stone, as if the wall might notice breeding, and pronounces it sound. He reaches into his generosity or his public relations and calls for a cask of ale for the diligence of my people. You can feel the mood ripple forward like sun along a pewter river. The brewer saint of both thirst and gossip raises her eyebrows to the sky as if to say, "At last a patron who understands morale." The cask thuds onto a block. A tap is set with a small, tactful hammering. The first tankards go to the masonry line, the second to timber crews, and a diplomatic measure is tucked aside for the children's bread bowls later. The yard exhales in unison. Modern aside, because you can't help it, this is management by walkabout with a refreshments budget. The KPI is smiles per minute. The ROI is the way people move faster after a generous nod. Honestly, if every status meeting ended with portable ale, you might have built 2 walls by now. Jokes arrive as they stubbornly do, because humour recognizes hierarchy and still insists on breathing. First, under your breath, you thank the Lord's horse for bringing the office to us. The horse twitches one ear as if it is indeed the CEO. Second, you whisper to your neighbour that the squire's gloves look shy of lime. Your neighbour replies they are allergic to adjectives like heavy. Third, because you keep your promises to yourself, you pat the new gate beam and murmur, "Try not to bow when they pass," which makes the carpenter snort into his sleeve and cough himself innocent. The Lord's visit isn't all ribbons and nods. He has questions about money. The steward asks whether the new moorage levy collected at the town gate from merchants bringing in salt and cloth has grown sufficient to pay the next lime burn. The reeve, who keeps sums in a head as neat as a ledger, explains that receipts are sober but promising, which in villager means we can afford bread and chalk. We'll haggle for cheese. A brief debate follows about whether to compel 2 outlying hamlets to send their carts twice a week rather than once. The master mason suggests that stone without carts is a sermon without verbs. The Lord nods magnanimous in the face of grammar. A compromise is born: carts twice weekly until harvest, then once with a promise to send oxen for the heavy loads if the hamlet's wheels sulk. The clerk writes this down with the gravity of a treaty. Mainstream detail worth pocketing mirage grants royal permissions to collect tolls for wall-building pepper the record in the 13th and 14th centuries, and the logistics they funded were exactly this sort of negotiation: how to balance seasonal labour coin and cartage. Sometimes the tolls paid for skilled masons imported from a neighbouring town. Sometimes they bought iron for cramps and dogs. Sometimes they lubricated the social machinery, so nobody felt too gnawed by obligation. The wall is a construction project, yes, but also a civics lesson with scaffolding. A light patter of rain begins just a trial version, and the noble party rearranges its faces into expressions that say, We love weather, in theory. Cloaks unfurl. A groom adjusts a hood with the sort of affection usually reserved for babies and cheese. The Lord declares with cheerful clarity that he will not disturb the fine progress and leave you to your admirable craft, which is noble, for I feel the first raindrop. The steward distributes 2 small purses. One clinks with coin for iron and nails. The other is stubbornly quiet and turns out to be filled with tallies for grain and ale. Pay in kind that will offend the hungry far less than silver locked in a chest. Quirky tidbit to make you smile, even as the drizzle tests your patience as the horses turn. One squire, perhaps aware that dignity is a draught animal that must be fed, offers the children a glimpse of his dagger's pommel, set with glass, pretending to be emerald. The children gasp dutifully, then turn back to the brewer's cart, because priorities are permanent across all ages. The Lord raises his hand in a blessing that looks suspiciously like, "We're off," and the party clops away in a small, brilliant cloud of leather and intention. The rain, freed from courtly restraint, deepens by one polite notch. Historians still argue whether such largesse casks coin kind. Was common kindness calculated politics, or obligation dressed up as generosity? You suspect all 3. A wall that bears the imprint of a lord's purse, strings, obligates loyalty. A cask that arrives at the right hour obligates gratitude. A tally for bread obligates continuation. Either way, the effect is practical, shoulders unknot. Jokes get warmer hands, move faster, and the idea of finishing before the real storm settles its full weight on the valley feels less like optimism and more like plan. You set down your chalk line, accept a tankard that wears a halo of foam, and listen to the village return to itself. The rope creak, the soft slap of wet mortar, the reassuring cluck of a hen who has found a worm and wishes to file a formal report. The nobility has gone, the wall remains, the weather has opinions. You sip bread in a glass kindness with bubbles, and feel strength burrow back into your arms. Payment today is not silver pressing your palm, it is bread promised ale poured, and a ledger that says the kiln will burn next week. And as you finish, the bell gives a small practical reminder that the kitchen fire expects company soon. The steward's purses were not the only gifts. The yard will pay its people in the currency that truly keeps a wall growing through rain, and rumour loaves and beer bowls and spoons warm steam, and the hush that falls when hunger loses interest. Raise your cup once, then set it down, because the next duty is simple and holy and perfectly timed. It's payday you can eat, and it is closer than your next swallow. Rain writes its polite cursive across the yard, a steady silvery handwriting that smooths dust into dark velvet and turns every roof into a soft drum. You smell heat before you see it. An oven somewhere behind the lane exhaling a warm, grainy sigh, and then another oven answering like a friendly echo. The bell does not ring for this because the village already knows payment comes with crusts and foam, with loaves that carry the day inside them, and beer that turns thirst into forgiveness. You follow the scent the way a needle follows a magnet. It leads you past stacked poles that glisten with rain like oiled ribs, past a row of buckets, catching drips from a kindly awning, and into a courtyard where bread is becoming wages right in front of your eyes. The bakehouse door yawns open and sends out a wave of calm. Inside, the light is the colour of butter scraped thin over late afternoon sky. The baker, arms floured to the elbow, moves like someone in a work song fold, slap turn smile, while a helper slides paddles into the oven mouth, each board a small raft ferrying soft planets into fire. Loaves rise dome by slow dome, and the air learns new adjectives: toasted, malty, sweet, sour, honest. In the corner, 2 casks squat like friendly bulls, their wooden staves dark with well-behaved damp. A trestle waits with bowls cups, and a linen already dotted with breadcrumbs that look like small islands where a mapmaker might hide sea monsters. A mainstream fact to anchor your hunger in towns that levied murage or mobilized corvée for building payment, often mixed coin with livery standard issues of bread and ale. Daily allowances might specify a loaf per worker, and measures of small beer calibrated for labour rather than revelry. Account rolls from great works, cathedrals, walls, bridges, itemise panis et servisia alongside iron and lime. Coin mattered, yes, but bread kept hands steady and beer low in strength, safer than some wells rich as soup in a different accent, kept throats civil and bellies content. On lean weeks, bread rations were the last line that kept grumbling from turning into absence. You step into the line. A girl with a baker's knife marks each loaf with a single neat cut, X for labourers, crosshatch for masons, a little corner notch for the wheelwright who insists his lunch should not be confused with anyone else's and who has very particular opinions about onions. Your turn, the paddle kisses the table, a round loaf lands in your palms with the gentle thump of a bird sitting on your hand and deciding you're trustworthy. It is still warm, a small sun cupped between your fingers. The crust crackles like polite applause. Beside you, a ladle dips into the beer and fills your cup with something that smells faintly of bread's cousin. Foam makes a quick white cap, then slides into a shrug. You break the loaf. Steam tucks into your face with the soft confidence of good news. The crumb pulls into threads tender and slightly glossy. You tear a piece for the child behind you he has already eaten, but this is a habit of villages. Bits of bread become social glue. The beer cools your mouth low and friendly like a brook that has no desire to be a river today. You take a second sip and feel the knot under your shoulder blade stop pretending to be a rock. If there is a currency, the wall understands immediately it is this one. Quirky tidbit to pocket in your apron of the mind, some bakehouses stamp loaves with tiny seals, symbols pressed into dough, so rationing can be audited by eyes and gossip alike. The seal might be the Lord's badge, the town's device, or simply the baker's pride. There are also whispered improvements for the big days, a pinch of caraway from the spice peddler, a handful of bran saved aside for the ditchers who insist it makes their bread stickier to the ribs, and on Saints' Eves, a faint brush of honey water on the crust as it leaves the oven, so the loaves gleam like they attended a small ceremony and behaved perfectly. You see a few glistening now and feel oddly honoured to be in their company. Outside, the rain drums a lighter tempo and the yard shifts toward the universal art of eating while standing. You lean under an awning with 3 other mud-splashed saints and talk with your mouths half full, which in this place is considered eloquent. The wheelwright produces a pinch of salt from a horn. The cooper offers a sliver of cheese rescued from an overambitious mouse. You contribute a fragment of onion that has been trying to escape your pocket all day. The combined effect is generous. The onion is outraged, the cheese apologizes on behalf of the cow, and the salt diplomat that it is makes everyone get along. Historians still argue about fairness and frequency. Were these rations daily, weekly tied to particular tasks or seasons? Did women on the workforce receive the same measures, or were household contributions expected to cover their portion? Records hint at variety. Some sites paid a higher bread weight to stonelifters on heavy days. Others standardized loaves, but allowed extra ale at press of work. You've seen both models. Today's distribution feels egalitarian. Every hand that lifted, mixed, or steadied receives a loaf and a measure, with a few extra stacked for those on night watch, because the moon does not bake. The discussion will likely continue in the brewer's doorway until someone invents a better way to count gratitude. Modern aside, whispered between sips, this entire ritual is a payroll app you can eat. No receipts, no passwords, just crust and kindness. Your balance updates in your belly, and the notifications are crumbs on your tunic. If the future ever forgets this, it will invent lunch stipends and call it progress. It's proper to make 3 small jokes, and the bakehouse smells like permission. First, you cradle the loaf and announce you've been promoted to middle management carbohydrates. The cooper bows with a stave and replies, "We need people like you." You groan, but it's the polite kind. Second, you ask the brewer if today's ale is architecturally sound. She taps the cask and says, "It bears weight." Third, you hold the loaf to your ear and claim you can hear the wall rising. For a second, everyone goes quiet and listens. You all pretend you heard it too, because maybe you did. Between bites, business hums on in softer voice. The reeve explains the new schedule for Kilnwood: 2 carts tomorrow, 1 the day after, while tearing his loaf with a precision that would make a surveyor applaud. The master mason checks with the steward that the coin purse sent earlier will be used for iron cramps rather than wine. The steward, to his credit, swears to it and breaks his bread as if sealing a contract. A water carrier tells a story about a night. She saw the bell rope swing by itself and realized the wind had learned the password. The children hover near the baker's helper, angling for heels and winning because heels are the currency of childhood. A little scene plays at the trestle. An old man, no longer sturdy enough for scaffolds, arrives with a basket of apples, the colour of polite sunsets. He traded work for fruit years ago. No shame in that. And now he pays the wall in sweetness. The baker counts apples. The old man counts loaves, and somewhere in that exchange the village proves that value can turn corners and still arrive on time. You take an apple and tuck it for later. The rain approves by writing 1 extra soft line on your sleeve. Here's a practical detail folded into the crumbs. Beer isn't only for drinking. A small bucket of dregs sits near the kneading board. The baker tips a splash into tomorrow's sponge because ferment and friendship are related, and the living yeast will remember the flavour of today's cheer. In the corner, 2 women pound a little mash of boiled barley and herbs to make a warm poultice for a mason's sore wrist. Food becomes medicine, becomes schedule, becomes wall. You stand in the middle of it and feel for 1 comfortable minute like a thread inside a very sturdy cloth. You wipe your hands on your trousers and feel the day reassemble itself, rain loosening light, returning a second wind floating up from the bakehouse door. You examine the crust-browned map of your palm and decide this is the only ledger you need. In a few minutes the yard will rediscover its older language of ropes and stone. The kiln crew will ask for help with fuel. The scaffold will raise its eyebrows and request 2 new braces. The chalk line you bought at market will sing its thin song across a fresh course. But for now, warmth moves from belly to fingers, and you carry it toward the work like a hidden lantern. 1 last look at the bakehouse notes a quiet custom, a small loaf set aside on the sill for the saints and the weary. No one claims it until someone needs it. No one asks questions when it goes missing. Villages are rich, not because they have coin, but because they have these little shelves that hold mercy. You nod to the loaf, as if speaking to a kindly neighbour you haven't met yet. Then the bell, kind, again not bossy, gives a short round reminder that the afternoon expects its due. You shoulder your tool, taste the last sweetness of malty foam on your tongue, and step back into the rain-washed yard, where everything smells newer than it did an hour ago. The wall has been paid in crusts and cups. Now it wants celebration, not merely sustenance. Somewhere out by the new gateposts you hear a drum that is not a drum, perhaps a bucket, perhaps a table, perhaps just hands and a snatch of song that is too jaunty for accounting. A banner appears like a joke turned into cloth. Someone is already dancing in boots that still carry mortar freckles. The next duty is not exactly work. It's the odd little festival villages throw when a gate rises and a course closes, the kind of joy that keeps a wall from feeling like a chore and turns stone into a story. Rain loosens its grip. The clouds remember how to be curtains instead of ceilings, and light slides back into the yard until every wet stone shines like it just learned manners. You think work will resume ropes, wedges the whole steady grammar, and then someone somewhere hits a bucket with a stick in a rhythm that is not quite music and not quite a mistake. Another bucket answers. A third becomes a drum with ambitions. You feel the change in your ribs before you understand it with your head. The village has decided the half-raised gate deserves a festival and the wall has no objections. You wipe your hands on your tunic because festivals prefer clean applause. It starts small and grows like a grin. The children arrive with wreaths of field flowers that smell of rain, and opinion twining them onto the new gateposts while pretending they are master decorators hired at scandalous rates. Women bring garlands of rosemary and mint. The scent unrolls across the mud like a green carpet, and a sprig finds its way behind your ear before you can protest that you are much too serious for this. You are not. A fiddler locates an upturned crate, claims it as a stage, and begins to tease a tune out of strings that have spent too long sulking in a sack. The bell gives one indulgent note, a round permission slip for merriment, and no one pretends to resist. A mainstream fact to anchor the confetti, medieval builds often paused for small rites when a milestone was reached. Not just the grand consecrations for cathedrals, but humbler topping moments, raising a principal beam, setting a gate lintel, finishing a course around a town. In northern lands, there's later written talk of topping out greenery fixed high to mark a timber's safe arrival, and earlier parish rogation processions beat the bounds of settlements, singing and blessing the borders. Town records mention livery of bread and ale for the raising of the gate, and guilds used processions to advertise craft pride right at the worksite. The ceremony might be half blessing, half crew morale, but it stitched community to stone in a way no ledger could. You join the short procession that has abruptly invented itself, neighbours walking the inside of the new gateway, like they're tracing the outline of a story. The priest appears with a font lid, held like an umbrella, and a bucket of holy water that the brewer teasingly calls the other ale. Sprinkles dust, the gate posts quick light, more like kisses than rain, and a soft prayer asks for strength without cracks and peace without boredom. You bow your head, not because you suddenly became pious, but because it feels decent to thank anything that keeps stones obedient and ladders polite. Then the reeve mutters a practical blessing of his own. May the pin not squeal, and the hinge not sulk. The carpenter says, Amen, with a look that suggests he's seen hinges with personalities. Quirky tidbit to set under your hat with the mint charms creep into masonry like ivy if you're watching. A coin under the threshold so the gate knows the taste of wealth. A little linen sachet of herbs tucked into a putlog hole that won't be filled for weeks to remind the wall that summer happened. A child presses a small bead into a mortar joint and announces it's for travellers to find with their eyes later. You've even heard of a shoemaker's old shoe too tired for walking, but still good at catching luck, immured near a door jamb. None of it shows on the finished face. All of it stays like a heartbeat you can't see. Musicians multiply without warning. The bucket drummers have recruited a hand drum with a goatskin head, a pipe whose notes hop like sparrows, and a hurdy-gurdy that sounds like a bagpipe went to finishing school. Someone whistles harmony from the scaffold where they have the altitude for confidence. The beat is gentle enough to respect the knees of those who carried water all morning, but lively enough to remind you your feet can still be persuaded after bread. You try one step, then two, and discover that dancing on a packed yard is like mixing mortar with your ankles, steady, circular, forgiving. Historians still argue whether these little festivals were official or just spontaneous excuses to open the good jug. Civic accounts tend to mention payments for garlands for minstrels for the ringing, which implies some planning. Folklorists see in them shadows of older border rites, circles, walked corners, touched bread shared where roads begin, strings of greenery fixed where air must pass. Skeptics say the paperwork speaks louder if there was fun. It came on saints' days, not because someone raised a gate. You live in a quieter truth. A wet afternoon salvaged by bread and music is its own saint's day, and the gate deserves a tune for learning how to stand. The brewer arrives like a benevolent tide. Her cask wears a wreath. Her ladle is a scepter. Small measures appear and do a little good without inspiring rooftop demonstrations. A tray of hand pies travels arm to arm, hot onion and cheese, a shock of pepper. The peddler swore came from the edge of the world, and a sweetness that has to be stealth honey, because no one with a ledger would authorize such joy. You bite and feel the flaky pastry, confess its secrets directly to your pulse. The fiddler sees that moment and leans into a flourish that mirrors the way your shoulders suddenly remember the concept of loose. Your 3 jokes today arrive pre-auditioned by merriment. First, you pat the new lintel and declare it a promoted plank. The carpenter replies, "It identifies as oak, and I support it." Second, you lift your cup and announce the gate is hinge curious. Across the way, a hinge squeaks once in inadvertent agreement. The yard applauds its comedic timing. Third, you tell the wall that if it wants to sing along, it must keep time. The wall, to its credit, keeps perfect time by not falling. There are games because games appear wherever a fiddle is. Children thread ribbons through each other's arms and learn a plait they will forget by dusk and remember at dawn. Adults form a slow, easy circle that even the grumpiest backs can forgive. Step, tap, turn, smile. Someone raises a banner, a scrap of linen with a sketch of the town device, and for a heartbeat, the crooked sky is corrected by cloth that knows how to be brave. You catch the smell of rosemary again, and suddenly understand why roads all over the world love parades. They were made for being walked with intention. Mainstream detail with a practical face, feasts or liveries attached to building milestones were not frivolities alone. They were wage supplements in kind and clever scheduling. A cask at a gate raising meant workers stayed near the site instead of straying to taverns 2 fields away. A loaf for each hand at a course completion meant quick return to the next course with smiles that did not need to be borrowed. Town rolls sometimes specify minstrels at the works as a line item, which reads like an early experiment in HR music as morale management. The debate among scholars is whether this was rare pomp or routine glue. You vote for glue. Pomp can't set mortar, but glue can hold a memory together when the wind scolds. Just when you think the afternoon has reached its warmest colour, a small ritual unfolds that even the donkeys understand. The priest asks the eldest woman present to lay her palm on the gatepost and speak a wish for those who will pass. She says, "May weary feet find kindness here." The yard is very quiet for a long breath. Then everyone touches wood, quick, shy, convinced without needing footnotes. The wish settles into the grain like oil. You suspect the gatepost will remember, and that isn't superstition so much as good carpentry. Wood stores warmth from hands better than it stores rain. A scrap of scholarly debate flutters in some antiquarians insist foundation sacrifices were once grim and that later charms softened the practice into coin and herb. Others counter that most walls rose without any drama beyond sore backs and the occasional goose-related incident. The evidence for anything darker is spotty and loves to be misread. You stand where the mortar is still damp and offer the third path. Whatever older stories whisper today's village chooses blessings you could tell a child at bedtime. Coins and sprigs and songs do the work fine. The wall prefers lullabies to legends with teeth. The light shifts toward amber. Garlands are lifted higher, tied off where the wind can admire them without making trouble. The fiddler slows the tune as if lowering a tray. You feel the festival settle into itself, not ending so much as folding like cloth put away while still warm from the iron. People drift to tasks with smiles that aim to stick. Tools reappear in hands as naturally as cups did an hour ago. The brewer caps her cask with a little pat as if praising a well-behaved child. The priest exhales the long exhale of someone who has been both useful and fed. The gate stands looking new and slightly pleased, which is exactly how a gate should look when it has been noticed properly. And yet the worksite cannot be made only of music. Where there is celebration, there is also aftermath trampled mint, to sweep cups, to rinse wax drips, to flick from plank edges a rogue ribbon, to rescue from a donkey's opinions. Off by the scaffold base, a soggy heap of rope begs for the kind of patient untangling that only the stubborn volunteer for. Near the lime pit, a skin has formed where it shouldn't, and someone will need to coax it back to usefulness without losing eyebrows. The happy day has shed small chores like confetti, and the wall has a sense of humour about who gets to pick them up. You stretch your shoulders, glance at the sky's calmer face and smile, because the next duty is not glamorous or tuneful, but it's the sort of work that makes everything else possible, and it may involve, if fate is feeling funny, convincing a very opinionated goose to vacate the fresh mortar. You learn quickly that a wall is not only the grand things, the stones that pose for paintings, the beams that make poems of their shadows, but also the small, stubborn chores that nobody volunteers for, and that everyone ends up doing anyway. After the music, and the mint, and the ribbon that pretended to be a banner, the yard exhales and reveals its true to-do list puddles. Where there shouldn't be puddles, chips of stone sharp enough to audition as teeth ropes that drank rain, and now sulk into knots, and somewhere, absolutely somewhere, a goose standing in wet mortar, like a minor official inspecting a civic project. You sigh, you roll your shoulders, and you pick up a broom heavy enough to be a relative. The sensory world resets. The festival's rosemary gives way to the clean, wet smell of sand. Puddles shine like shy coins. A low wind moves across the ground and edits the surface into dark and light patches. You put the broom's bristles to work with slow, deliberate strokes, the kind that make a sound like velvet being taught how to whisper. Brush, gather, scoop. The dustpan is a board with a lip, the bucket a veteran of many indignities. You coax stone chips into the bucket and feel the day reassemble into order, one scrape at a time. This is not glory. This is gravity's housekeeping. A mainstream fact to fill your sleeves: medieval building sites relied on labourers and hodmen whose job descriptions were the honest spine of the project, carrying, clearing, fetching, dumping, sweeping, bailing water, protecting fresh work with hurdles and cloth. Town ordinances from places with crowded streets demanded builders keep lanes, passable chip piles tamed, and slurry off the commons. Fines waited for messy yards that turned alleys into mud sermons. Guild records and account rolls list wages paid specifically for cleansing the work and for bearing rubbish proof that the wall's negative space, the stuff removed and tidied, was as budgeted as the stones that stayed. You and two others lay straw in a softened patch to make a temporary path. The straw sighs underfoot and releases the friendly barn smell of dry summers. A child fetches a hurdle, a woven panel of willow, and you pin it against the base of the scaffold to catch the next avalanche of sensible debris. Over at the lime pit, a skin has formed where steam met air. You lift it with a paddle, fold it back into the slurry, and watch it disappear like a regret bravely reconsidered. You drape damp sacking over today's fresh joints so the wind doesn't steal moisture. The cloth clings with a grateful heaviness like a cat pretending the lap was its idea. Now the goose? It is not a metaphor. It is an actual goose, standing in an actual joint, leaving webbed opinions where you planned neatness. You approach with diplomacy. The goose, whose sense of personal jurisdiction exceeds all maps, hisses like a kettle arguing with its lid. You try charm. The goose tries legislation. You offer a handful of chaff. It considers your bribe and then pecks the bucket as if you had insulted its lineage. Finally, you do what wise people do. You borrow the broom and gently persuade the bird to relocate 2 dignified yards away, muttering apologies to mortar and waterfowl alike. The goose leaves a signature no one asked for. You smooth it with a wet brush until the joint forgives the incident. Quirky tidbit to tuck behind your ear: some crews swore by keeping a cat near the tool chest to ward off mouse-nibbled cords. And if you asked the superstitious mason to keep jealous spirits from tangling lines. Others claimed that stale beer made an excellent wipe for steel proteins, and all leaving chisels with a shine that smelled faintly convivial. You've seen both a tabby asleep on a pile of pegs, dreaming of a world where donkeys purr, a chisel being pampered with yesterday's ale while its owner solemnly announces he is polishing morale. You carry slops to the spoil heap, a small hill that has learned patience, and notice how the yard arranges itself into flows, clean in, dirty out. Sharp contained, soft laid, wet covered, dry encouraged. Someone rakes the path so wheel rims won't carve back into ruts. Someone else picks nails from the ground with a magnet hung on a string, a trick you insist is witchcraft, and the smith insists is common sense. A woman with a bucket of ash sprinkles a delicate grey frosting on the mud slick near the well to give boots grip. The ash drinks the wet and repays the favour by being less muddy than mud. Historians still argue about the exact people who did these thankless chores. Some accounts emphasise hired male labourers, others the presence of women and older folk paid in coin or rations to tend fires, carry water, keep paths safe, and guard children from the stray enthusiasms of donkeys. Probate lists show widows owning brooms baskets and hurdles associated with work around the works. Skeptics warn against romanticising inclusion. Optimists point out that the wall swallowed labour indiscriminately, and anyone with hands found them noticed. The truth is, in your broom calluses, and in the easy way a grandmother scolds a mule care labor-built walls too. You circle to the gate mouth where small, infuriating pebbles have decided to be ball bearings. You kneel, extract them grain by grain, and wonder whether stones gossip at night about how to be most inconvenient. A neighbor arrives with a bucket of warm water infused with a friendly herb and sets it down like an apology for the world's roughness. You dunk a rag and wipe your hands, lime tingle replaced by comfort. Your jokes today are modest, the sort that tip their hats. First, you tell the goose it's promoted to assistant inspector of joints unpaid, of course. Second, you christen the magnet on a string Saint Benedict, patron of lost nails. Third, you point at the tidy spoil heap and declare it your alternative castle, which earns a grin and a promise to besiege it later with pies. You slip into the unglamorous rhythm of tool care. Trowels get a scrape against a scrap of board. Chisels a wipe and a dab of oil. Mallet faces a respectful inspection for cracks that shout before they fail. Rope gets uncoiled, shaken, and hung where the breeze can pass its fingers through the fibers without judgment. You count ladders with your eyes as if your gaze could tie knots. You check the lashings that looked bored in the rain and tighten them until they hum a note you trust. The scaffold thanks you with silence, the good kind, the kind that means I will hold. Mainstream detail with a practical shine, medieval municipalities often regulated where builders dumped spoil and ulk rubble. Some required carts to carry it beyond the ditch, others allowed it to raise lanes if spread and beaten properly. On big works, rubbish men were paid to maintain order around kilns and lime pits, both for safety and for neighbourly relations with people whose windows did not appreciate dust. You've seen the consequences of ignoring these rules: a lane that becomes a canal after one rain, and a fishwife whose vocabulary could sand wood. Order is cheaper than apologies. A little weather returns nothing dramatic, just that wide, soft rain that seems to fall from everywhere and nowhere. You pull a waxed cloth over the exposed tool chest and anchor it with 2 stones and a faith that you measured the wind right. You stretch a bit of linen over the chalkline reel so it doesn't drink itself into sulking. You watch the raindrops size themselves on the fresh boards and then shrug off round and well-behaved because the carpenter taught the grain to slope kindly. It is amazing what wood will do for you if you say please. Now the latrine. No one writes poems about it, but everyone wants it done. You and a resigned friend carry a bucket of ash and a bundle of sweet rushes to the little screen at the yard's edge. The ash sweetens the pit and convinces flies to study abroad. The rushes get strewn over the path so feet come away less honest. You trade grim jokes quietly because the wind does not need the encouragement, and accept that when the village says we built the wall, it includes absolute solidarity in chores that are more public service than epic. Quirky footnote: because the mind likes strange anchors. There's a rumour that some crews add stale urine to lime for extra bite. The ammoniac insult supposedly makes mortar set with swagger. Others swear it's nonsense, a vanity chemical with more smell than science. You've watched arguments about it last an entire lunch while the baker's cat auditioned for sainthood under the table. Historians still argue too, recipes vary and proofs are slippery. You decide your nose has veto power and your wall will be plenty strong on sand, lime and thyme. By late afternoon, the yard looks less like aftermath and more like intention. Chips are in piles that mean something. Tools line up like polite geese. The actual goose has found something else to object to. The paths run straw dry. The lime pit breathes evenly under its cloth. You feel an obscure sense of achievement that tastes like clean water and sounds like a broom resting against a wall without sliding. It's not the triumph of height. It's the satisfaction of readiness. Tomorrow's work will stand on this order, the way a course stands on a bed joint, quietly, successfully, invisibly. You straighten, press your hand into the small of your back until the muscles agree to be friends again and look across the site. The scaffold climbs like a wooden thought. The wall has added 1, maybe 2 honest spans. The gate mouth wears its garlands like a memory of music. And then you see it rolled out from a shed with a ceremony entirely invented by its own size, a great wooden wheel, ribs as thick as your arm's spokes, like small trees, a drum for a heart. Men guide it with ropes, girls trail it with wonder, and even the donkey flicks its ears as if recognizing a colleague. The thing looks like a ship's secret, a mill's dream, a hamster wheel built for saints. You know what it is in rumor, if not in practice. You know what it might do to your back's morale. You also know scholars grumble about dates and places and whether villages like yours ever used them. But your eyes say a new chapter is trundling into the yard, smelling of oak and ambition. You set the broom aside, wipe your palms on your trousers, and feel your breath lengthen with an odd, buoyant caution. If that wheel becomes your next co-worker, stones will rise, as if they learned manners overnight. If not, you'll still climb with your own legs, which have always been loyal, if occasionally sarcastic. Either way, the yard tilts toward a noise you haven't heard, yet the footfall of people inside a machine walking their circle to lift the world. The next duty promises a lesson in weight and wit, in ropes and ratios, and in whether the village believes in giants made of wood. You stand before the wheel like a pilgrim before a relic, half skeptical, half ready to believe. Up close, it's bigger than rumor-suggested oak ribs as broad as your forearm spokes that taper with the quiet intelligence of a bow, a hub fat with iron bands that have decided to be rings instead of snakes. Two carpenters fuss at the axle with wooden mallets, tapping a rhythm so steady it sounds like they're lulling the wheel to cooperation. The air smells of warm shavings and a shy tang of tar. The ground is sugared with sawdust that clings to your boots like affectionate sand. Somewhere a breeze finds its way through the wheel's lattice and makes a hush, as if telling the yard to use indoor voices. Walkers inside, someone asks, and the wheel answers by being exactly the size of a small room. A ladder lashed to the rim leads up to a door hole cut between spokes. Inside, slats line the inner circumference, each plank a petal where feet will tread. You picture yourself in there walking the circle, the slats talking back through your soles, the drum of your step turning into lift, the way breath turns into speech. A heavy oak drum sits on the axle wrapped with a rope thick as your wrist. The rope leads up through a sheaf, an iron-sheathed pulley under a gin mast, then down to a stone in a sling, waiting to discover it weighs less than it thought. Mainstream fact: to anchor your oar tread wheel cranes, great wheels are attested in Europe by the High Middle Ages. Manuscript illuminations and building accounts show them hoisting stones at cathedrals and town walls. Harbour cranes with twin wheels stood for centuries at places like Bruges and Utrecht. Inland works used single-wheel hoists perched on timber frames called gins or derricks. A pair of workers inside a wheel could multiply their effort by a quiet geometry of radius and axle turning steady, walking into the kind of lift that makes human backs feel seen. It wasn't magic, only a patient ratio, but it looked like magic, which is almost as useful on a hard afternoon. You run a hand along the rim and feel the carpenter's plane work smooth, where feet will learn the curve, rougher on the outside, where hands need grip. The smith steps in with a pawle, a wooden tooth hinged to bite into a ratchet ring so the drum cannot unwind rudely if someone sneezes at the wrong time. He oils the pin with a practiced dab and tests the catch, clack, 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 a heartbeat disguised as engineering. Beside him, a third neighbour rubs tallow into the rope, feeding it like a working animal, making sure the fibres won't fuzz into sulks under load. The whole contraption feels both simple and ceremonial, like a well-designed prayer wheel that answers in stones rather than syllables. Quirky tidbit nudges your ribs on some sites. The first person to walk a new wheel gets a wedge of cheese and a ribbon tied to their sleeve, so fortune knows who went first. Other crews break a heel of bread inside the wheel and smear a little ale on the slats. Feed the circle, and the circle feeds you. You've also heard nicknames: squirrels, hamsters, spider-men, gentle teasing for the walkers, whose job is to be the calmest part of a moving circle. One old mason swears his first wheel had a stubborn plank that squeaked a note in B every third step. To this day, he cannot hear that note without wanting to lift something. Inside, you go one careful boot after the other, the ladder creaking in a language you instantly respect. The interior is a peculiar theatre light, strips past the spokes. The slats bend your stride into a tide, and the smell is fresh oak with a rumour of linseed. Your hands take the handrail the carpenter thoughtfully pegged to the inner ribs. You begin to walk slow at first, feeling how the wheel prefers roundness to enthusiasm. The drum murmurs as the rope takes load. The powel ticks politely as the ratchet records your progress in wooden syllables. Outside, the stone lifts, deliberate, persuaded, no drama. You feel it through your ankles the way you feel a river through a boat's plank pressure, transformed into forward gravity, recast as patience. You're not alone in there. Another walker joins and the rhythm becomes partnership. Step, step, tick. Step, step, tick. You talk in short sentences so breath remembers to be a friend. He jokes that you're working the graveyard shift literally, and you laugh because inside the wheel, humour likes to arrive at a walking pace. A boy below calls up the height. Half a man, and a hat. Two men using the informal units that build confidence. When the block reaches the line of the new course, a mason steadies it with a pike pole, and you soften your stride to hold it there, trading speed for steadiness the way a lullaby trades notes for hush. Historians still argue about details that matter to the backs of people like you. Did small villages commonly deploy great wheels? Or were they luxuries of richer towns and grand religious works? Illuminations love to draw them. Account rolls love to charge for them. Archaeology is coy, leaving post holes and iron fragments that might be from cranes or might be from optimistic fences. Some scholars point to rotatable harbour cranes, permanent monumental as evidence of wide familiarity, while others insist rural builders stuck to simple gins, capstans and muscle. Your village has borrowed this wheel from a market town 2 days away, along with a carpenter who talks to it like a pony. The compromise between scholarship and reality is rolling right under your hands. You step down to watch a second lift. The riggers make small measured movements, no heroics, just sound knots and good signals. A hand goes up, stop. The powel settles, clack. The sling gets adjusted because corners deserve courtesy. Then walk. The wheel answers faithful dog on a gentle lead. You notice the gin mast's back stays taut as violin strings anchoring the whole frame against the pull. You also notice a brake, a wooden shoe that can press the drum ready to kiss friction into obedience if a gust tries to make mischief. The rope hums at a note you can feel in your teeth, an inconvenient place to store notes but effective. Modern aside, bubbles up before the wind steals it. Each walker is maybe 100 watts of steady output, enough to light a few good candles in a world that will not invent electric bulbs for some centuries, yet multiplied by the wheel's radius and the axle's drum to send stones skyward as if they've learned to behave. You are for the moment a very polite power plant in socks. If the future sells memberships to this workout, it will call it Medieval Stairmaster and add lavender towels. 3 jokes because the wheel likes them. First, pat the pal and say, "You're the only one here who's allowed to backtalk." Second, to your fellow walker, "If we keep this up, we'll arrive at Tuesday by noon." Third, when the stone settles perfectly and the mason raises his trowel like a conductor's baton, you bow from the waist, inside the wheel, invisible and satisfied. Laughter comes up through the spokes like warm air. You take a turn outside as signal a palm raised for stop, finger circling for walk level, hand for easy. The rope's song tells you more than sight, a gritty rasp when it rides a bit too dry, a deeper hum when the stone's momentum asks for manners, a quiet purr when everything agrees. You watch the pal faithful metronome, because its tick is the lullaby of safety. The yard begins to understand the new choreography, quarry carts queue where their noise won't confuse calls. Mortar carriers time their approaches so no one walks under a load. Children are gently shooed to sensible radiuses with the promise of a grand turn at the signal flag later. Another mainstream detail worth a tuck behind your ear. Some sites mounted twin wheels on a shared axle, so 2 teams could lift heavier loads or balance a counterweight, while a ground crew managed slings and taglines. Others rolled their crane along timber tracks. As the wall progressed, the whole machine migrating like a patient beetle. Your single wheel sits on the stout trestles for now, but you can see the carpenters already eyeing a second set of holes where the frame will march forward next week. The wall teaches everything to walk, even the things with legs made of trees. Debate keeps its seat at the edge of your mind. A visiting scholar, ink on his fingers, Curiosity in his shoes murmurs that wheels this fine belong to cathedrals, not village ramparts. The master mason answers without stopping his trowel. The stone doesn't care who lifts it. The scholar concedes the point with a smile and scribbles something that will make other scholars argue over ale. Historians still argue whether medieval building sites were laboratories of shared technology or islands of local habit. You decide the distinction doesn't help your rope, which prefers not to fray either way. By late afternoon, your legs have learned the wheel's sentences. Your stride shortens on the first third of the lift, lengthens as inertia turns friendly and shortens again to settle the block like a loaf being eased onto a shelf. The world narrows to useful sensations, the gentle pull in your calves, the cool of the slats through your soles, the way the wind sneaks through the spokes to lay a finger on your neck, just when you need a thought to be cooler. The bell gives a small quarter note, not to command but to admire. Even it approves of machinery that turns steps into height. Outside, someone lays their palm on the stone you just set, and you can read the pride in their shoulders. The wall climbed faster today than yesterday, and not because anyone shouted. It climbed because a circle persuaded a straight line to be ambitious. You step out of the wheel with the slight sway of someone who has been at sea for an hour, and now owns a private tide. The ground steadies you like an old friend. The rope rests coiled and content. The pawel job done sits in its notch like a cat in a sunny window. The sky, however, has been writing a different story along the ridge. Clouds have linked arms darker and thicker, and the wind now carries that metallic hint that says rain has opinions. You know what storms can do to lime and to moods. You also know that no wheel, no matter how polite, can lift morale as quickly as weather can try to drop it. You look from the new machine to the new course, to the tarps folded like secrets near the lime pit. Your hands already remember which lashings want tightening when the first fat drop hits a plank. You draw a breath that tastes of oak and ozone. The wheel will have its day. The sky plans one too. And as the first distant rumble practices its punctuation somewhere beyond the fields, you feel the village pivot with you toward covers and buckets, toward sand, to throw at slick places, toward the kind of patience that outlasts a cloud's tantrum. The machine taught you about lift. The weather will now teach you about holding. Because the next duty isn't about walking in circles, it's about keeping yesterday's careful joints from turning into today's polite soup. The sky does not ask for permission. By the time you wipe your hands on your trousers and look back at the treadwheel crane, the clouds have already rolled in from the horizon, like an army of grey-cloaked monks, each carrying a sermon in thunder. The first fat raindrop lands on your forearm and spreads wide, cold and heavy, as if the heavens are testing mortar strength with water instead of chisels. You squint upward, catch another drop on your cheek, and know the storm has changed its mind from maybe to definitely. The bell rings. Not the slow, everyday work bell, but the urgent pattern that means cover tie, protect. Everyone moves at once. Children scatter to doorways. A pair of oxen is led under the cart shed. You seize a rope coil, already slick with damp, and jog to the scaffold. The air tastes metallic like iron filings and green leaves, the unmistakable recipe of lightning's impatience. Your heart beats in time with the sky's murmurs, each step faster than the last. A mainstream fact to root yourself in the rush weather was one of the constant enemies of medieval building projects. Too much rain and mortar washed out too much sun, and joints dried brittle, a storm at the wrong time, and days of work could vanish back into slurry. Chronicle accounts complain of a season wasted for rain and orders to cover with hurdles and cloth lest all be undone. Lime pits especially demanded protection. Water could flood and ruin the chemical balance, and a drowned lime pit was both dangerous and useless. So every yard kept tarps, hurdles, wicker screens, and sheer stubbornness ready for the sky's moods. You and two neighbours wrestle a length of canvas over the lime pit, pegging it at the corners, the cloth snapping like a sail in wind that hasn't yet chosen a direction. The rain grows teeth-stinging now, drumming hard on your back and the boards. The scaffold groans as ropes swell and knots complain. You climb a ladder knot in teeth and lash down a loose plank before the wind convinces it to practice flight. Below, the brewer, apron plastered to her legs, hauls her cask under cover, shouting at a donkey who disagrees with the definition of inside. Everyone has a job, and no one has time to argue. Quirky tidbit to distract yourself for a breath: some masons swore that rainwater gave lime a kinda cure if caught right after the first thunder. They would place bowls on scaffolds calling it sky water to mix into special joints. Others called that nonsense, insisting rain brought impurities that ruined the mix. Historians still argue about it, combing through chemistry and chronicles alike. But you know that when water comes sideways and fills your shoes, no one has patience for sky water. They want dry mortar and no collapsed joints. Lightning scribbles across the sky, a long, bright crack, like the world's biggest quill making an emphatic correction. The thunder follows closer sound so thick you feel it in your ribs before your ears. For a moment you remember why towers exist. Height means visibility, but it also means vulnerability. You duck your head instinctively, clutching the rope tighter, muttering a quick prayer that feels less like piety and more like begging physics to mind its manners. Your jokes today arrive wet but necessary. First you shout to your neighbour as you fight the tarp. If the wall wanted a bath, it should have asked politely. He laughs in gasps, too busy to answer. Second, as the water streams down the half-finished stones, you mutter, "Ah, so this is the moat preview." Third, when the donkey finally ducks under cover, you bow dramatically and announce the inspector has arrived. Even the brewer, soaked and muttering, snorts through rain. Historians still debate whether villages paused all work during storms or pushed through. Some accounts show total halts, scaffolds emptied, tools hidden, everyone waiting it out in halls or barns. Others reveal frantic work under covers, rushing to protect wet mortar or salvage partially set courses. Archaeological traces even show joints where sudden rain left a washed layer later patched when the sky relented. You suspect both were true. Sometimes you stop, sometimes you fight, depending on how stubborn the cloud and how fragile the course. The rain thickens into curtains. The sound is endless, every surface a drum. Water runs in little rivers along scaffold poles, dripping from knots like tears. You station yourself at the mortar beds, brushing channels with a wooden board so the pools drain off instead of soaking in. A boy brings you a bundle of fresh rushes to lay across the slick planks. You thank him with a grin that looks more like a grimace. He grins back anyway and darts off to rescue a pile of wedges from drowning. Modern aside whispered into the storm, "This is project management by weather app, except your app is a goose and your forecast is wet wetter or stay indoors." You half envy the future, its tarpaulins, its forecasts, its lightning rods. Then you remember that in the future people will still argue about rain at picnics, and you decide nothing changes except the thickness of the shoes. When the worst comes, the wall disappears in mist stones blurred by sheets of water. The scaffolds vanishing into grey, the yard shrunk to a few paces, where you can see your own breath mixing with rain's. But within that small circle, the village works like one animal, steady, braced, moving from knot to bucket to cloth to door. You realize storms are also rehearsals, teaching everyone how to hold together when danger isn't rain but riders. The wall is the excuse, but the weather is the drill master. And just as suddenly as it came, the storm decides it's had enough of its own performance. The rain slackens, the thunder marches away in slow grumbles, and the clouds tear open a strip of pale sky that looks embarrassed about the fuss. Drips continue from every rope and plank, steady as applause after the show. You are soaked, tired, but oddly proud. The wall still stands, the lime pit still breathes, the scaffolds hum with readiness rather than ruin. Neighbours emerge from sheds and doorways, blinking like owls in daylight. Someone cheers half-heartedly, more relief than celebration. The brewer uncaps her cask again, because this is the hour when relief needs company. Children splash deliberately in puddles because they're still children, and because someone should enjoy what everyone else has just fought against. You rub water from your eyes, tilt your face to the strip of sky, and exhale a breath you didn't realize you'd been holding. But storms don't just bring puddles, they bring stories. And as people gather around, wringing sleeves and shaking out cloaks, the first tale begins. Do you remember the great storm, the one when... You know it will grow taller every retelling. The wall will be higher, the thunder louder, the goose more heroic. And you also know that the next duty is already waiting. After a storm, the village doesn't just dry, it talks. Stories spread faster than water, and words, unlike ropes, never rot. You smile because you suspect the next hours will be less about mortar and more about memory, about how weather becomes legend before your socks are even dry. The storm leaves behind a yard that smells of wet earth, cooled lime, and sheep that have suddenly remembered they exist. Every surface gleams the wall like a polished tooth, the scaffold like a row of slick violins, the puddles like a sky that fell and forgot how to stand. You know the next work is not climbing or hoisting, but repairing. Rain may have retreated, but it left fingerprints everywhere, mortar streaked thin, where it was meant to be stout joints, softened into paste stones, nudged ever so slightly from their proud lines. This is the storm's private joke. It lets you believe the danger is over, and then it leaves you with homework. You tramp the scaffold with a cautious boot rope slick under your palm water, dripping from the end of your nose like punctuation. Every few steps you stop, crouch and inspect. Mortar here has been washed half out its bed, visible like bones under too thin skin. You scoop with your trowel, testing the firmness. It squelches, unimpressed. That means tomorrow it will crumble, and tomorrow's wall will look like it forgot its breakfast. You sigh and scrape it out, ladle in fresh mortar, and smooth it with the tired tenderness of someone rewriting a page the rain tried to smudge. Mainstream fact to steady your soggy mood. Medieval masonry was at the mercy of weather. Too much water, and the lime paste thinned, refusing to cure. Too little, and it dried too quickly, crumbling instead of bonding. Builders used cloths hurdles and temporary wooden roofs called shelters to shield critical courses, but storms often undid whole days. Chronicles of London's wall works in the 13th century complain of labours undone by tempest. Cathedral fabric rolls note extra wages paid for mending the rain-spoiled courses. Even today, putlog holes in old walls sometimes show streaks where fresh mortar was replaced, in patches silent records of afternoons when the sky forgot its manners. Down in the yard, you join the others in damage patrol. Wooden buckets are pressed into new service as bailers. Water is scooped from half-dug trenches where it sits sulking. A ditch meant for the moat has become a reflecting pool where ducks are holding a smug council. You and two neighbours dig a quick runnel with spades to convince the water to take its business elsewhere. It flows grudgingly then, with enthusiasm, and finally with the self-importance of a brook that thinks it has always lived here. Your boots collect mud in new inventive patterns. You call them architectural embellishments, and no one argues. Quirky tidbit to remind you that mischief isn't modern. Some builders salted the edges of mortar beds after storms, thinking it would stiffen the joints faster. Others laid flat tiles or shards of pots over courses like improvised umbrellas. Archaeologists occasionally find these ceramic rain guards still sitting inside walls, proof of days when storms came too quickly to be tidy. One French account even claims a mason swore by adding a splash of strong ale to rain-thinned mortar to restore its vigour. Historians chuckle, chemists frown, masons nod knowingly. Your job becomes rhythm scrape out the weak ladle in the strong. Scrape ladle smooth. Each joint feels like a confession, each fix a forgiveness. You whistle low, not to be heard, but to keep your breath company. The wall accepts the mending without complaint. Stones don't blame the sky. They only wait for humans to try again. You find the lesson both frustrating and oddly comforting. Historians still argue about how much storm repair slowed projects. Some say weeks pointing to stretched budgets and grumpy account rolls. Others insist villages adapted quickly, reassigning hands to salvage, keeping momentum by treating repairs as part of the work, not a setback. You lean toward the second camp. After all, here you are scraping and smoothing the work, continuing in a different costume. The storm was not an ending, just a reminder that walls rise in conversation with the sky, not in defiance of it. Modern aside, whispered to yourself as you dump another bucket, this is medieval QA testing. Rain is the inspector nobody invited, checking every joint for weaknesses. Failures aren't shame, they're feedback. If you built a software wall, this would be the bug report in very wet handwriting. You grin, imagining a clerk scribbling known-issue mortar leaks when exposed to water. No patch notes, just more sand. The jokes today are damp, but insistent. First you pat a stone and say, "Don't worry, we'll get you a towel." Second, as a bucket sloshes down your tunic, you declare baths should be optional. Third, when a frog hops out of the trench you just drained, you bow and say, "Inspector General approves." The frog blinks with ancient indifference and resumes its important business of being amphibian. By mid-afternoon, the yard looks less like a battlefield and more like a hospital that knows how to heal. Cloths hang over the worst courses, pegged down with stones. Sand has been laid in slick patches so boots find grip instead of humility. Buckets line up, filled not with rain, but with fresh mortar eager to erase the storm's signature. Even the wheel crane, which sulked in the downpour, has been wiped dry and checked its pawl oiled again until it ticks with cheer. Mainstream fact: with a local accent, villagers sometimes marked storms in memory more than in record. A wall might have one course slightly darker, or a layer where the stonework is just a shade rougher the storm line. Oral history would point to it. That was the year of the great wet summer. In cathedral naves, scholars trace those courses like rings in a tree, reading weather in stone. You imagine your wall will have its own faint scar, and future children will touch it and say, "Here is where the rain tried." Evening approaches with clearer skies, the storm's tantrum reduced to damp footprints. The bell gives a slower call, the kind that sounds like relief. Workers stack tools, shake water from cloaks, wring sleeves until rivulets run down their arms. The baker arrives with a basket of still warm rolls, the brewer with mugs that steam at their lips. Everyone leans into the comfort bread, beer and stories, because after every storm comes the telling of it, and the telling is as important as the repairs. Neighbors compete for exaggeration. The thunder shook the wheel like a child's toy. The rain drowned my mallet, I had to resuscitate it. The goose swam across the yard like a swan of destiny. Laughter follows each, louder than thunder ever dared to be. You join in, offering your own. I'm fairly sure the wall blinked. They nod solemnly as if this is entirely plausible. The storm's true legacy is not damage but narrative. Tomorrow you'll forget the cold, but you'll remember the jokes. And just when the yard begins to feel like itself again, the reeve clears his throat and mentions what everyone already knows. We've mended joints, we've drained puddles, but the moat that half-dug scar is now a pond, and we must decide if we deepen it, drain it, or dance around it. A silence settles, not gloomy, but thoughtful, because moats are mysteries, and timing them has always been a debate. You sip your beer, wipe crumbs from your lip, and know that tomorrow will not be about storm scars, but about water by design. The next morning begins with mist rising from every puddle the storm forgot to drink. The yard smells different now, less of lime and tar, more of wet grass and mushrooms waking up too early. Where the ditchers had been carving yesterday's shallow trench for a moat, the rain has done them the courtesy or the insult of finishing half the job. A long mirror stretches around the base of the wall, reflecting scaffold and sky alike. Ducks have declared ownership. Children stare at it with the solemn fascination usually reserved for fire. And the reeve, practical as a boot heel, announces, "Well, if the moat wants to be born, we'd best decide how to raise it." You edge closer, boots sinking slightly in mud that squelches with a sound like bread dough giving up secrets. The moat, still more pond than fortress, glistens under the pale sun. Reed stalks from last year's marsh fringe poke through, and the water ripples lazily when the wind drops its finger in. It looks more like an invitation to bathe than a defense, but you know, water around a wall is a language worth learning carefully. A mainstream fact to root your thoughts: moats in medieval Europe came in many tempers. Dry moats, essentially wide ditches, were common in upland castles, where water was scarce or stone strong enough to discourage undermining. Wet moats flourished where rivers, streams, or high water tables could be bribed into service. Archaeological surveys show village fortifications often dug ditches as much for material clay, for bricks, rubble for fill, as for defence. Water was a bonus or a hazard, depending on geography. In marshy Flanders or parts of France, moats were as natural as shoes after snow. In drier Spain, they were luxuries. Your village stands where rain and stream conspire, so the debate isn't ditch or moat, but shallow or deep dry or wet blessing or nuisance. The master mason squats at the edge drawing lines in the mud with a stick explaining that water can undermine a wall if it sulks too close. We line it or we keep it dry, he says. The ditchers argue back. A wet moat feeds fish, keeps reeds for thatch, and teaches raiders to swim before they steal. The reeve rubs his chin, calculating in silence how many cartloads of earth must move either way. You stand behind them, half listening, half hypnotized by the way the water licks the bank, as if impatient to be told its job. Quirky tidbit worth pocketing in some towns, moats doubled as laundries, fish ponds, or even skating rinks in winter. Chroniclers tell of children sliding along frozen defences while their parents prayed enemies didn't think to bring skates. In summer, women beat laundry against whetstones at moat's edge, turning defence into chorus. A 15th century Flemish account mentions eel traps set under wooden bridges leading over moat's protein and protection, all in one slippery bundle. You can imagine tomorrow's supper wriggling right up to the gate if the ditch is managed cleverly. Historians still argue about the real value of village moats. Some see them as symbolic and expensive puddle meant to say we take defence seriously even when water barely reached a man's knees. Others stress their deterrent effect. Even a shallow ditch slowed cavalry-funneled attackers and gave defenders the gift of time. Archaeology has found evidence of deliberate flooding systems, sluices cut from streams, channels feeding into ditches, clay linings baked hard as crockery. But the balance of water management and wall stability was delicate, and in many places moats were abandoned or redug again and again, proof that villages were experimenting as much as fortifying. You wade a boot into the edge, it seeps in cold as confession, and pull it back, shaking mud off like an apology. Your neighbour jokes, "We've built a bathhouse without walls." Another suggests charging ducks tolls. You contribute your own. "At least now we have a swimming test before hiring guards." Laughter spreads thin but steady because humour floats best on water. Modern aside whispered into your sleeve, this is civil engineering meets plumbing nightmare. Someone in the future will call it hydrology, draw maps with contour lines, and produce textbooks that smell of dust instead of mud. For now it's villagers squinting at puddles, arguing in proverbs, and deciding whether to invite fish to be neighbours. Work begins whether decisions are final or not. Crews arrive with wicker hurdles and start lining the banks to keep mud honest. Children carry bundles of reeds to weave into mats that will pin the soil down. Ditchers scrape edges sharper with long-handled shovels, pulling the slope into a frown. Buckets bail water from where it crowds too close to fresh mortar, pouring it back into the lower trench where it can sulk without mischief. Someone suggests planting willows along the far bank to sip the excess, and suddenly a new argument about roots versus shade takes root itself. Quirky custom emerges at noon. A woman throws a handful of herbs, thyme sage, a sprig of rue into the new water so it knows its manners. Children follow with pebbles, each plop a tiny wish. A mason mutters that the moat now has better seasoning than his dinner. Historians might call it superstition. You call it neighbourly introduction. If you're going to live beside a ditch that pretends to be a river, you might as well start with friendship. As the sun leans westward, the moat looks less like a rain accident and more like intention. The banks hold firm under hurdles. The water sits in the right places, not all of them, but enough to make sense. The ducks, offended at the sudden formality, move to the stream. The reeve, seeing order appear where chaos splashed, nods once and declares, "We'll keep it." But shallow now, deep later. It's a compromise written in mud, but a compromise nonetheless. 3 jokes seal the decision. First, you tell the reeve to add lifeguard to his titles. Second, when a child tries to float a stick across the moat, you mutter, "First invasion repelled." Third, you lean on your shovel and sigh. At least if the wall falls, it will fall with a splash. The laughter is tired, but true, the kind that stitches a hard day into something the memory can bear. As dusk arrives, torches wink to life along the scaffold, their light shivering on the new water. The moat glows gold and black, half mirror, half mystery. You watch it for a long moment, realizing it has changed the wall's voice. Yesterday, it was only stone and wood. Today, it is stone, wood, and water, a trio more complex than before. Tomorrow, it will complicate every job, but tonight, it sings quietly, a bass note under the wind's higher hum. And just as you turn to leave, the bell rings, a single note, not urgent, but curious. You know what it means. The wall has grown again, and with growth comes new work. Tonight it is water, tomorrow it will be timber again. For the scaffolds need more bracing, the wheel, more, anchoring the gate, beams more confidence. Timber has its own voice, creak, crack, sigh, and tomorrow you will hear it speak in chorus. The morning begins with the smell of cut wood resin, sharp as a shout sap, sweet as spilled honey bark, rough beneath your fingers. After days of stone, mortar, and water, the wall now asks for timber, and timber arrives like a small forest on parade. Carts creak under their loads, long oak trunks still bristling with leaves at the crown pine beams, sticky to the touch bundles of thinner ash poles tied in neat, stubborn circles. The air hums with saws, adzes, and axes, each sound with its own accent. The wall is no longer only about stone. Today it will learn to breathe in wood. You follow the carpenters to the scaffold, where beams need bracing platforms widening, and the gate mouth demands a lintel strong enough to hold its own weather. The carpenters move like dancers who prefer rhythm to grace step-measure cut wedge pin. They carry axes with edges so clean they look like arguments sharpened to the last word. One man knocks the butt of a beam on the ground and listens to its echo, judging whether the tree inside has agreed to be architecture. Another shaves curls from an oak plank, each shaving falling to the ground like golden ribbon fragrant enough to make you forget lime for an hour. A mainstream fact to anchor the smell in your nostrils, medieval construction leaned heavily on timber, not only for scaffolding and tools, but for the wall itself. Hoardings, those wooden galleries jutting from battlements, gave defenders cover to drop stones or pour water. Gatehouses relied on great oak doors, banded with iron portcullises sliding in wooden grooves. Even stone vaults leaned on timber centering until the mortar cured. Records from works in London, York and Paris list X beams of oak, Y cartloads of ash poles, Z 100 nails for hoardings alongside lime and stone. Without carpenters, a wall was a sulking pile of rocks. With them, it became a fortress with manners. You lend a hand steadying a ladder while a carpenter checks lashings on a new brace. The rope groans as it tightens, then settles with a sigh. You smell tar where knots have been sealed, a scent that clings to your tunic as if it wants to move in permanently. The carpenter tests the joint with a few thumps of his mallet. It responds in the positive, a deep wooden yes that you feel more than hear. He nods at you, the rare currency of approval, and moves on. Quirky tidbit to keep in your pocket. Some carpenters carved small symbols into beams before fitting them, a quiet signature of pride and prayer. Triangles, crosses, runes, even doodles of animals. These little marks are still found today, hidden inside walls where no one was ever supposed to look. Some were talismans against fire, others just graffiti with good intentions. You glimpse one now, a circle with a line through it scratched by knife tip. The carpenter catches your glance and shrugs. Keeps the worms from laughing, he says, and leaves it at that. The gate mouth becomes the stage for the day's main drama. A lintel beam so massive it needed 6 men and a donkey to coax it from the cart now waits to be raised. The treadwheel crane is summoned again, its spokes creaking, the pole ticking. Walkers step inside their rhythm, slow and steady. The beam rises with the grace of something that knows how much it weighs, but chooses not to brag. Ropes sway, men guide it with poles, and when it slides into its waiting cradle above the posts, the whole yard exhales like it just passed a test. The carpenter taps, wedges the mason, checks the fit, and the reeve mutters an audible thank you to whichever saint handles beam placement. Historians still argue about the balance of wood and stone in such works. Some claim wooden hoardings were temporary scaffolds disguised as defences removed once danger passed. Others insist they were permanent part of the architecture of fear. Excavations of charred ruins show both stone walls still standing timber galleries reduced to ash. The truth lies in seasons and budgets. Stone was forever but expensive. Timber was plentiful, flexible and quick. Villages often built in layers stone core timber skin, then more stone if fortune permitted. You stand in the middle of that compromise-smelling sap while standing on lime. Your jokes today echo wood's humour. First, when a shaving curls so tight it looks like a piglet's tail, you hold it to your ear and declare you can hear the forest gossiping. Second, when the crane squeals under the lintel's weight, you pat it and say, "Don't worry, it's only a small log with delusions of grandeur." Third, when a carpenter drops his mallet and it bounces twice, you announce the mallet just wanted to rehearse its dance. Everyone groans, but the laughter lingers like smoke. Modern aside tucked into the rhythm of hammer on peg, this is your construction site's version of IKEA, except no instructions, every piece is custom, and the Allen wrench is a mallet that weighs as much as a child. And unlike IKEA, if you assemble it wrong, raiders might notice. You decide medieval carpenters were both engineers and stand-up comedians, because only humour explains why anyone would climb slick scaffolds with an oak beam balanced on ropes. By late afternoon, the scaffold sings with new strength. Braces stretch diagonally like arms insisting on balance. Platforms widen, planks thump under boots without flinching. The gate wears its lintel like a crown. The hoardings begin to sprout rough frames jutting out, promising a future where defenders can stand dry while the world outside experiments with weather and arrows. The smell of sap is everywhere, bright and insistent, clinging to your tunic, your hair, your hands. You will carry the forest home tonight whether you want to or not. And yet the work doesn't end with fitting. Every new timber needs protection. Buckets of pitch are rolled out, their contents heated until they shimmer like black honey. Carpenters dip brushes, bundles of rushes tied to sticks, and smear the tar onto exposed beams. The smell is overwhelming, sharp, smoky, medicinal. The pitch glistens, then dulls, as it soaks in, turning each beam from tree to soldier. You help hold a pole, while a neighbour paints it, the tar dripping onto your boots until they shine like peculiar leather. You cough, laugh, and remind yourself that at least the smell will keep flies at bay for a week. Quirky practice, half practical, half ritual. Some crews dropped hot pebbles into pitch buckets to keep it thin, then tossed the first dribble onto the ground as an offering. For the worms, they said so, the insects would bother the earth instead of the wood. You watch one carpenter flick a drop into the mud with solemn precision, then wink at you. Insurance. You nod because after yesterday's storm, you've learned never to argue with insurance no matter how sticky. As the sun sets, the scaffold looks stronger, darker, steadier. The smell of tar lingers, the wood gleams like it has been dressed for a feast, and the wall itself seems to breathe easier with its new bones. You lean back, rubbing pitch from your hands with sand, watching how the fresh timber changes the wall's silhouette against the sky. It looks more serious now, more ready to be what it promises. But the day ends not with tar, but with sound. Because with timber finished, carpenters always test with hammers not to drive nails but to listen. They strike beams lightly, one after the other, and the wood answers in notes low, high, deep, hollow. You listen, and it becomes a music unlike anything mortar ever sang. The wall has a new voice now, half forest, half fortress, humming under the night's first stars. And as you descend from the scaffold, wiping your palms on a rag that no rag should have to endure, you hear the reeve already planning aloud. Next, we brace the hoardings, and after that, we build the watch platforms. You nod, smiling at the idea of new tasks, waiting like guests at the edge of tomorrow. But for now, you walk home smelling of resin and tar, and you realize the wall has made you part tree, part human, part story. The morning greets you with a bell that rings less like a command and more like a reminder today is for the watch platforms. Yesterday the timber was a skeleton tarred and braced into obedience. Today it grows mussels, planked floors, railings, little huts of defense perched like nests above the wall. You rub sleep from your eyes, boots from mud, and trudge to the yard where beams wait like oaths not yet spoken. The scaffold hums with saws and hammers. The sound's sharper now, not the heavy thud of stone, but the brisk crack of wood submitting to geometry. You smell sawdust, sweet and nutty, mixing with yesterday's tar still lingering in your tunic. The carpenter's chalk lines streak beams with pale blue marks that look like someone has been drawing rivers across the timber. A child coughs theatrically in the dust, and then sneezes so hard he drops his bundle of nails which scatter like rain made of iron. Everyone laughs because no morning begins properly without a little chaos. A mainstream fact to ground your ears: watch platforms were essential features in medieval fortifications, whether in castles, towns, or village walls. They served both as vantage points and as psychological tools. Height gave authority, visibility, and the sense of readiness. Some were simple timber decks lashed to the top course. Others had roofs and shutters, becoming mini-huts against weather and arrows. Documents from 14th century towns mention wages for the carpenters who framed the towers and for shingles laid upon the watch hut. Archaeology has uncovered beam sockets and nail clusters on old wall tops, ghosts of wooden superstructures long rotted away. You climb to the first platform site, balancing across planks still damp from dew. Below, masons adjust courses, their rhythm steady. Up here, carpenters measure with long rods, murmuring fractions of cubits, then arguing whether a thumb more counts as precision. They pin joists into slots cut into the wall top, wedge them with oak, then lash them with hemp ropes tarred into black snakes. You help haul planks up by rope and hook your hands sticky with resin, your arms aching in a way that feels honest. The planks arrive with a hollow thump waiting to be persuaded into floors. Quirky tidbit that makes you grin: some platforms doubled as sleeping lofts for the watch. Chronicles mention guards rolling up cloaks and napping under makeshift lean-tos, their snores echoing across battlements. In winter, straw was scattered to soften the planks. In summer, garlands of herbs were hung to keep flies and bad smells polite. One Flemish record even mentions a watch hut lined with rush mats, so the Reeves nephew wouldn't complain about drafts. You imagine future guards arguing over who gets the warm corner, while below villagers argue over who gets the last onion. Historians still argue about how permanent these wooden platforms were. Were they sturdy long-term additions repaired seasonally, or were they temporary scaffolds rebranded as defences during tense months? Some accounts call them hourly works, suggesting they were thrown up quickly. Others describe careful joinery and shingled roofs, implying decades of use. Your wall seems to prefer the middle path beams, heavy enough to last planks, plain enough to replace without mourning. The Reeve mutters about budgeting for new boards every few winters, and you nod, because wood listens to weather more than to money. You watch the crane lift a smaller beam this time, guiding it into its notch with a pole. The powel ticks its rhythm, the rope hums, and the beam slides into place as neatly as a loaf on a shelf. The carpenter wedges it, tests with his weight, then waves you on. You step gingerly onto the new floor. It springs under your boot, alive unlike stone, and for a moment you feel like you're walking on a drum. From here the yard shrinks into a pattern: masons' ants at their rows, children bees with buckets, the lime pit, a white pond. The moat glimmers beyond reeds nodding. You understand why watchmen liked this view. The world looks organised when you're above it. Modern aside, half joking, half odd, this is your medieval balcony upgrade. You could charge rent for the view if you had tenants. Instead, you have rain squalls, geese, and the occasional neighbour pretending to be a sentry. If Instagram existed, this would be the moment for a filtered shot caption: it Fortress Life. View goals. You snort at the thought and nearly drop your mallet, which would have been a different kind of hashtag entirely. Jokes come easier in the air. First, you pat the railing in progress and say, "At least we've built a fence against the sky." Second, when the carpenter drops a peg and it bounces into the moat below, you remark, "Well, that's one way to arm the fish." Third, when the Reeve climbs up nervously and peers over you, whisper, don't look down unless you're checking the goose patrol. He chuckles, pale but amused. By afternoon, the first platform is complete a square deck with waist-high rails braced with diagonal beams that look like confident arms. A simple roof of split shingles shades half the space nailed on with iron heads that catch the sun like freckles. A ladder leans into it from the wall walk, sturdy enough to bear armoured boots. Children beg to climb. Mothers glare them back to earth. A mason wiping lime from his brow stands below and salutes with his trowel as if the platform has already won a war. Quirky practice. The first watch assigned to a new platform often left a mark. Sometimes a carved initial, sometimes a charcoal drawing of a face, sometimes just a tally scratched into the beam. These graffiti remain centuries later. Faint lines where someone once announced I was here, I stood watch. I was part of this wall's heartbeat. You find yourself fingering a spare nail, tempted to scratch your own mark. You don't. Not yet. The wall will tell you when. The carpenters aren't done. 2 more platforms rise by sundown. Each gets faster, smoother, less argument about fractions of cubits. By dusk, the wall wears little wooden hats, jaunty but determined. Smoke from pitch pots curls into the twilight, joining cooking fires in a haze that smells of tar and onions. The platforms gleam dark where they've been sealed, promising to withstand at least the next rain's temper. And when the bell rings to end the day, you linger on the new deck, looking out across fields, silvered by the sinking sun. You see the road winding away, a line of possibility. You see the village roofs clustered like geese in the reeds. You see the wall itself, not just height, but shape, learning to be more than defense, learning to be a stage for lives. The wind touches your hair, the wood creaks softly beneath you, and you realize that standing watch isn't only about guarding against enemies. It's also about seeing your world more clearly. But vision invites questions, and questions invite debate. Already you hear voices below, some arguing that the platforms need more roofs, others that they should hold braziers for night fires, still others that they're too tempting a target. You know the next days will bring as much arguing as hammering, because the wall is made not only of stone, wood and water, it is also made of opinions, and those unlike mortar never fully set. The platforms stand dark against the morning sky, their new beams creaking softly as if testing their voices. You wake with the smell of pitch still clinging to your hair and the faint ache in your shoulders that tells you you've been part tree for a day. But as you trudge back to the yard, you notice something different in the air. It isn't only the hammering or the gossip, it's the muttering of old stories, the kind of sideways talk villagers share when they're uneasy. You hear words like luck, protection, bad eyes, and you know before you even arrive at the scaffold, the wall is about to inherit its first round of superstitions. At the gate, a woman kneels with a child beside her, pressing a tiny shoe into a crack near the base. She does it casually as if tucking laundry into a chest, then pats the stone like a nurse reassuring a restless sleeper. When you ask, she smiles faintly and says, "Shoes keep the bad spirits out, they've walked the world already." You glance at the shoe, worn smooth, and wonder if the wall now has a heartbeat that fits into leather. A mainstream fact to anchor the strange comfort across Europe. Builders tucked charms into walls, floors, and doorways. Archaeologists have found shoes, bones, dolls, and written prayers hidden in beams or bricked over in hearths. Sometimes it was deliberate ritual blessings for protection. Other times it may have been chance an old shoe lost a bird that crawled into a crevice. But chronicles do mention foundation rites in which animals were immured grimly to strengthen walls, and later softened versions, coins, herbs, wooden tokens became the custom. Your village, practical but not joyless, prefers the gentle kind. You watch another neighbour sprinkle salt into the mortar bucket before the mason lays the next course. "So the wall will never thirst," she explains, eyes serious. The mason shrugs and stirs. Salt is cheap compared to collapse. A boy plucks a sprig of yarrow and tucks it into the scaffold lashing, whispering that it keeps knots from slipping. You'd laugh, except the knot does seem to sit a little prouder afterward. Quirky tidbit that earns a grin in parts of Germany. There are records of live cats being walled in to bring vigilance. Later centuries reveal their skeletons in ruined castles, grim, debated, and maybe exaggerated. Others tell of builders singing nonsense rhymes as they placed the last stone, believing rhythm sealed strength. Some even buried tiny clay faces under towers so the building would remember joy. You much prefer the version with shoes and herbs, it's superstition. You could explain to a child without giving them nightmares. Historians still argue whether these customs were widespread or rare. Some call them survivals of pagan foundation sacrifices softened for Christian ears. Others insist they were just local quirks magnified by accident of preservation. But when you see half a dozen villagers unasked slipping charms into cracks, muttering wishes as they pass a stone, you realize it doesn't matter what scholars decide. For this wall here now, superstition is another kind of mortar. It fills the gaps science hasn't yet claimed. You climb onto the new platform, and there in the beam's underside is a fresh carving, 3 circles interlocked. Someone's hand, careful but not artistic, has left a sign that could be a prayer, a signature, or just a way of saying I was here. You touch it with your fingers, the wood warm in the morning sun, and for a moment you feel as if the wall is quietly gathering not only labor, but memory. Each scratch, each tucked herb, each whispered rhyme threads in the invisible fabric that binds stone to story. Modern aside, whispered with a smirk, this is medieval insurance policy. Forget premium payments, here you insert a shoe. No paperwork, no clauses, just leather as your warranty. It's low-tech risk management with very human logic. If the world is unpredictable, at least you can bribe it with familiar objects. You wonder if the future will laugh or envy the simplicity. Probably both. Your 3 jokes for the day wander in shy but useful. First, you hold up a sprig of yarrow and announce, "Ah yes, the medieval duct tape." The carpenters chuckle and tuck more into their belts. Second, when a mason lays a coin under a stone, you say, "Careful, the wall will start charging tolls." Third, when someone carves a crude face into a beam, you bow to it and ask if it approves of your hair. The beam wisely says nothing. By afternoon, the wall begins to look less like mere engineering and more like a scrapbook of beliefs. Here a coin gleams faintly in mortar, there a garland of rosemary flutters until the sun wilts it. A child insists on burying a pebble he calls lucky near the lime pit, and the adults indulge him because luck is never wasted. The reeve frowns, but not very hard. He knows morale can't be bought as cheaply as a sprig of rue. Quirky notes some believe the charms don't just protect but strengthen. A shoe that walked far lends endurance, salt lends purity, bones lend permanence. Whether true or not, the villagers carry themselves differently after tucking them in. Their backs straighten, their hands steady. Belief is scaffolding too invisible but firm. You see it, you feel it, and you suspect the wall does as well. As evening falls, the wall wears its hidden trinkets like jewelry only it knows about. To the eye, it's stone, timber, and pitch. To the people, it's also shoes, sprigs, coins, words, small offerings folded into the fabric of defense. You climb down, feet tired, head heavy, but chest oddly light. You realize that superstition has done its job. It has made the wall feel less like a pile of things and more like a partner. And as the bell rings dusk's gentle call, the reeve mentions tomorrow's work, finishing arrow slits, and parapets the details that make a wall more than a barrier, the parts that demand patience rather than force. You nod smiling because you know that alongside chisels and ropes, someone will slip a charm or two into those slits as well. Because arrows may fly tomorrow or years from now, but tonight, luck has already been mortared in. The morning smells of cool stone, and yesterday's tar, a mixture that clings to your throat, but feels like progress. The wall is taller now, its head brushing the horizon, but what it lacks are the eyes and the crown, the arrow slits that will peer outward, and the parapets that will give the defenders their edge. Today is not about hauling or hoisting. Today is about chiseling patience into stone and coaxing small details that matter more than their size suggests. You run your hand along the unfinished top rough under your palm and feel the promise of what's coming. A wall that sees, speaks, and shelters. The masons begin early. Their hammers strike lighter, faster, different than when they shape great blocks. These are taps meant for precision, like drummers keeping rhythm for an audience of hawks. Dust rises in thin veils catching the slanting sun, and the sound is hypnotic. Chip, chip, scrape, breathe. Arrow slits must be narrow on the outside, widening within, so defenders can aim with freedom, while enemies see only a mean little crack. The geometry is careful too wide, and it invites arrows inward, too narrow, and the archer curses instead of shooting. You crouch beside one mason as he leans back to measure the angle, squinting as though arguing with the stone. "It wants to be stingy," he mutters. You nod. Stone always wants to keep its secrets. Mainstream fact to anchor your medieval arrow slits, also called loopholes or embrasures, date back to at least the 12th century, often shaped as simple vertical slits that later evolved into cross-shaped openings. They allowed defenders to shoot while exposing as little of themselves as possible. Parapets, meanwhile, were the low walls or battlements atop the main wall, often crenellated with alternating merlons, solid uprights, and crenels gaps. Together, they turned walls from mute barriers into instruments of defence. Surviving records from castles and town walls note wages for shaping the slits, and for finishing the battlements, often described as the final touch before consecration or celebration. You take a turn, sweeping chips away the sharp flakes biting at your boots. The masons joke that they'll leave a slit shaped like a goose for you, but instead they carve narrow, elegant lines that catch the morning light like shy mirrors. From the outside, they look like frowns. From the inside, they bloom open, giving you a surprising sense of freedom as you peer out. You lean close and imagine the future watchman standing here, bow in hand, eyes narrowed against the sun, muttering about geese in the moat. Quirky tidbit worth pocketing: not every slit was meant for arrows. Some doubled as vents, some as peepholes to watch the road without announcing yourself, and a few were turned into improvised trash chutes when discipline grew lax. Archaeologists once found chicken bones stuffed in a loophole in a ruined English keep, proof that someone's lunch outlasted their lord. You promise yourself you won't treat these slits like bins. They deserve better than chicken bones. Historians still argue about whether crenellations were functional first or decorative first. Some walls flaunted painted merlons and carved finials, more for intimidation than practical cover. Others show wear patterns that prove defenders leaned on them daily. Documents describe guilds sponsoring individual merlons, donations marked with coats of arms, a medieval version of putting your name on a brick. Some scholars even suggest parapets were as much civic pride as military tool. A wall without battlements looked unfinished, like a song without a chorus. The carpenters arrived to help finish the top, their mallets ringing differently than the masons. They lay plank scaffolds across the crown, balancing with easy grace, while you pass up baskets of stone chippings to fill gaps. The smell of pine shavings briefly outshouts the dust. Then comes the lime wash, a slurry smeared across the parapet face to bind loose grit and gleam white in the sun. When it dries, the wall will shine like bone, visible for miles. Some say the brightness discouraged attackers, dazzling them on hot days. You think it simply looks proud, like a fresh haircut on a feast day. Modern aside, muttered as you rub mortar into a joint, this is the medieval equivalent of a user interface. Everything before was back-end engines, scaffolds, code in stone. Now you're designing the screen, people will see the crenels and slits, the crown against the sky. If walls had logos, this would be it. You imagine a merchant riding up the road, squinting at the new battlements, muttering, "Ah yes, version 2.0. Your three jokes arrive as naturally as dust in your hair. First, when the mason fusses over angles, you suggest carving the slit wide enough for his head. Second, as the parapet rises, you say, "Finally, a fence for giants." Third, when a boy asks what the gaps are for, you reply, "To let the wind gossip through." He nods, entirely convinced. By late afternoon, the top of the wall has transformed. Crenelles gape like toothy smiles. Merlons stand like stern eyebrows. Arrow slits wink in the sunlight. The parapet stretches in neat rhythm stone, alternating with air. A pattern that feels almost musical when you walk it. You pace the new wall, walk boots brushing grit, and the view steals your breath, the fields wide and green, the stream silver in the distance, the village clustered like chicks around a hen. Up here, you feel taller than you deserve. Quirky practice emerges the first to walk. The new parapet is expected to drop a pebble over the side, a token to teach the wall where down is. You oblige flicking a stone that bounces 3 times before splashing in the moat. The masons cheer, the carpenters grin. Someone scrawls a charcoal mark on the inside merlon, a crooked star that will fade, but not before it teaches the wall how to hold memories. Historians still argue whether villagers truly used these defences often, or whether they were mostly symbolic, a stage set against raiders who might never come. But walking here with the sun setting red behind the parapets, you realize the truth doesn't matter. The wall doesn't only defend, it reassures. It says we can see, we can stand. And that's enough to make sleep easier in a world where storms, hunger, and enemies all knock at different doors. The bell rings slow and deep, echoing off the new merlons. The sound feels prouder than before, as if even the bell knows it has a better perch. You descend with sore legs, dusty face, and a grin you don't try to hide. Tomorrow, the tasks will be slower, finishing details, patching, arguing about what belongs where. But tonight, you know the wall has grown eyes and a crown. It sees the world, and the world sees it back. The wall has eyes now, slits to see, parapets to grin, but a wall that cannot be heard is still incomplete. Today, the bell tower rises. Not the great soaring spire of a cathedral, but a stout wooden frame set just inside the gate, high enough that its voice will carry across the fields, sharp enough that even a farmer waist-deep in grain, or a shepherd, lost in his own woolly thoughts, will stop, look up, and listen. The village needs more than stone. It needs a signal, a heartbeat, a sound to call it together when words won't do. You arrive at the site, where timbers have already been laid out, in a careful grid, thick oak posts still bleeding sap where the bark has been stripped. The smell is resinous, sticky, almost sweet. Carpenters squat over the joints, cutting mortars and tenon with patient rhythm, tap, shave, test, repeat. Each joint is an argument between precision and brute force. A hammer convinces where a saw hesitates. Mallets sing their low wooden songs. From a distance, the whole effort looks like men playing an enormous board game, arranging giant sticks into patterns that only they can read. A mainstream fact to anchor your sense of ceremony: bell towers, whether stone or timber, were as much about community as about defense. Town charters in medieval Europe often required a bell to call citizens for market worship or alarm. Records from England mention payments for raising the frame to bear the bell. In some places, bells told curfew each night, time to douse fires, bar doors, and keep the peace. A fortress wall without a bell was like a body without a voice, strong but mute. The crane wheel groans again, pressed into duty to lift the vertical posts. Walkers inside march, their steady circle ropes creak, poles tick. The oak beams rise into place, guided by poles and shouted signals, until they settle upright, with a thump you feel through your boots. Wooden pegs are driven home with a final resonant thwack. The frame begins to lean skyward, each post leaning on its neighbour like friends finding courage in company. You hold ropes taut with others' palms burning until the structure stands on its own. The whole yard cheers, not because the work is finished, but because gravity has agreed to behave. Quirky tidbit to brighten your sweat bells were often named baptized, even treated as semi-living companions. Some bore inscriptions: I call the living, I mourn the dead, I chase the thunder. Others were blessed with holy water, wrung for the first time only after prayers. In folklore, a bell could frighten away storms or demons, its sound a kind of invisible wall. Children whispered that bells could talk to each other across valleys. You imagine your modest frame hosting a bell that believes itself a gossip carrying secrets from field to field. The smith arrives with the clapper, a long iron tongue that looks too serious to belong to a bell, and inspects the yoke. His hands smell of smoke and oil. He mutters about balance and torque as if the bell were a temperamental horse. The mason jokes that if the bell won't behave, they'll feed it more mortar. Everyone laughs except the smith, who scowls until someone passes him a cup of beer. Then he laughs too, because even iron needs lubrication. Historians still argue about the size of bells in village fortifications. Some claim small hand-sized bells sufficed for alarm. Others point to archaeological finds of larger cast bells, their bronze fragments suggesting serious volume. Written rolls mention hauling bells from monasteries or commissioning new ones at great expense. Your village seems to compromise not a cathedral giant, but not a cowbell either. Enough to wake sleepers, enough to make geese reconsider their priorities. Modern aside whispered with a grin, "This is your medieval push notification system. Forget glowing screens, your updates arrive in bronze booming across fields. Market open, curfew begun, raiders sighted, or occasionally the reeve has misplaced his shoes again." You imagine villagers groaning, "Ding, not another update." Your three jokes find willing ears. First, when the crane lifts the half-framed belfry, you mutter, "Looks like a giant's chair for playing cards." Second, when the carpenter polishes a peg with spit before hammering it, you ask, "Is that the official varnish?" Third, when the smith insists the clapper must be perfectly centered, you whisper, "So it doesn't develop a lisp." The apprentices laugh loud enough to make the reeve scowl, which is its own kind of victory. By afternoon, the bell itself is brought out a bronze drum with flared lip green, with age in patches gleaming golden where hands have polished it. Children gasp as though they've seen treasure. The priest blesses it with a murmured prayer, sprinkling water that turns to steam on the hot bronze. A garland of herbs is draped over it, rosemary again, because rosemary insists on being everywhere. Then with ropes and grunts and the steady plod of the crane, the bell is hoisted. It swings slowly upward, groaning like a whale until it rests in its cradle. Pegs are driven, ropes lashed, wedges tapped. The bell is home. Quirky custom. The first ring often belongs to the youngest child, present a symbol that the future itself calls the village together. A little girl is lifted up her tiny hand, pulling the rope. The bell answers with a clear, proud note that startles crows from the fields. The sound hangs in the air, vibrating through chest and soil alike, as if the earth itself agrees to remember. Goose flesh prickles along your arms. For a heartbeat, the wall feels less like defense and more like promise. Historians still argue whether bells were truly effective alarms. Could a farmer a mile away distinguish storm from raiders from time to eat? But standing here with the sound still echoing in your ribs, you know the truth is simpler. The bell unites. Its voice makes one heartbeat out of many. Whether it warns or celebrates, it reminds the village that it is one. As dusk comes, the new tower rises like a wooden crown inside the gate. The bell dark and silent now, saving its breath for the next call. Torches flicker, shadows stretch long, and the wall hums with a new confidence. The masons grin through dust. The carpenters slap beams like old friends, and even the smith allows himself a satisfied sigh. And yet in the quiet that follows, you know tomorrow's work will shift again. The wall has eyes, crown, and voice. What it lacks is memory, an inscription, a story written in stone or wood that says, "We were here, we built this, we mattered." Tomorrow will be about carving those words, about chisels biting letters instead of lines. The wall will learn to speak not only through bells but through script, and once words are etched, they endure longer than voices. Morning comes softer this time, as if even the bell knows today is about remembering, not rushing. The wall stands finished in its shape, stone courses, neat timber, braces dark with pitch parapets, grinning with teeth of crenels, and the new bell tower still humming faintly from yesterday's first note. What remains is not structure but story. The reeve has called for inscriptions, names, dates, blessings, something carved into stone that will outlast the backs and breaths that made it. Because walls defend, but they also testify. If you want the future to know you were here, you must write it in chisels. The masons prepare their chisels, carefully edges, honed sharp handles wrapped in leather to soften the strike. The sound of carving is slower than building. Tap, tap, scrape. Each stroke takes away less than a fingernail of stone, but each also adds permanence. A block near the gate has been chosen as the ledger. Already faint outlines mark its face letters in a careful script, curves and lines traced with charcoal. They will become words. This wall raised in the year of our Lord, followed by names of lords, masons, reeves, and if the village insists, the people themselves. A mainstream fact to anchor your sense of importance. Medieval builders often left inscriptions, either grand carved tablets in cathedrals, coats of arms in castles, or humble mason's marks, graffiti initials. Some walls record the name of a master mason or patron. Others offer blessings like Pax Huech Domui Peace to this house. Inscriptions served as both record and talisman, turning the wall into a witness that spoke across generations. Archaeologists still find scratched crosses, tally marks, even doodles of ships or animals in fortress walls, the quiet voices of workers who wanted the stone to remember them. You take a turn holding the mason's guideboard steady as he chisels a letter A. Chips fall like tiny white feathers. He pauses, blows dust away, and grins. It will still say this when our children's children are ghosts. You nod, thinking how rare permanence feels in a world of storms, hunger, and taxes. To see your work outlast you is as close to immortality as most villagers ever come. Quirky tidbit worth smiling at: some masons hid jokes in their marks, tiny faces with stuck-out tongues, crude animals, even riddles no one has solved. One ruined abbey revealed an inscription that read, "Pray for me, for I was thirsty." Scholars puzzle over whether it was a pious plea or a mason griping about lack of beer. You consider carving "Remember the Goose," because surely future generations should know about that feathered inspector. Historians still argue about how much of this carving was official and how much was private rebellion. Official inscriptions gave credit to patrons, unofficial ones gave dignity to hands. In cathedrals, bishops' names were carved in grand Latin, while masons' marks hid at the base of pillars. Some say this was hierarchy, others a collaboration every hand, leaving what was proper to it. On your wall, the line blurs. You see the Reeves name, yes, but also a girl scratching a star into wet mortar with a stick, and no one stops her. The wall will remember both. Modern aside whispered under your breath as you sweep chips from your lap. This is your version of a credits roll. No film, no screen, just stone. Directed by rain, produced by mud, starring everyone you know. It's less flashy, but 1,000 years from now, it'll still be legible, which is more than most films can say. 3 jokes arrive with the rhythm of the hammer. First, when a mason carves the Reeves name in large letters, you mutter, "He's finally taller than us." Second, when a child scratches a crooked heart beside the text, you announce first fan mail for the wall. Third, as dust coats your hair white, you sigh. I've aged a decade since we started this inscription. The laughter makes the work easier, and the stone seems to enjoy being included. By noon, the words are complete. The block reads, "In the year of grace, with hands of many, this wall was raised." No single name is larger than the others. The priest sprinkles water, the crowd murmurs assent, and you feel a quiet pride that the wall itself now speaks. Beyond that block, smaller scratches multiply: initials, tally marks, secret symbols. The carpenters carve little tree runes into beams. A child etches a smiling sun. The brewer scrawls a mug shape, grinning when no one objects. The wall has become a book written by many hands, a story of labour and laughter set in stone and wood. Quirky practice: a final loaf of bread is pressed against the inscription so its flour dust settles into the cuts. To feed the words, someone explains. Then the loaf is torn up and shared, so the people and the wall both eat from the same blessing. You chew your piece crusty and warm and imagine the stone itself swallowing crumbs of memory. Historians will one day argue about this wall. Was it built for true defence, or mostly for pride? Did the villagers expect attack? Or was it civic theatre? Was the inscription official propaganda or genuine record? You smile because you know the truth is less tidy. It was all of those things. It was also bread-shared jokes told gooseprints in mortar and tired backs leaning on scaffolds. The wall is defence, but also diary. As the sun sets, the bell rings, a single deep note echoing across the moat. The inscription glows in orange light, the words sharp and certain. People linger, touching the letters, tracing them with fingers as if rehearsing for memory. Then slowly they drift away toward fires and suppers, leaving the wall to its new silence. You stay a little longer, your palm pressed against the stone. You think of storms endured, of beams hoisted, of laughter spilled across mud. You think of how a wall is never only stone, it is every hand that touched it, every story whispered into its cracks, every joke and prayer baked into its mortar. And as darkness folds over the village, the wall stands ready, ready to defend, ready to remember, ready to outlast you. Its crown of parapets cuts the stars into patterns, its bell breathes low like a sleeping animal, and its inscription glows faintly with chalky dust. You exhale long and slow, knowing the work is done. Tomorrow will bring chores, disputes, storms, and laughter again. But tonight, the wall finally feels complete. The night comes slowly, as if reluctant to interrupt the day's pride. Torches gutter and go out one by one, leaving the wall silvered under moonlight. The moat holds a pale reflection broken now and then by a ripple where a frog jumps. Wind brushes across the parapet soft, and even a lullaby sung without words. The village has fallen silent, doors, barred hearths, glowing children asleep under blankets that smell faintly of wood smoke. You walk once more along the wall steps, slow shoulders, loose heart, lighter than it has been in weeks. Each stone is cool beneath your hand, each beam faintly warm where pitch still clings. You hear faint creaks, the wall settling into its own skin. And you know it is not weakness but comfort, like a body sighing before rest. The bell above you sways slightly in the night air, but does not ring. Its silence feels kind, as though it knows sound is for tomorrow. Tonight is for sleep. You pause by the inscription fingertips, brushing its grooves. The letters are rough, but they catch the moonlight turning into silver scratches. They will be here long after your feet have left this wall, long after your laughter has faded into fields and stories. Your breath slows. The moat's water breathes in time, lapping gently at its banks. The wind softens further, carrying the smell of damp stone, rosemary drying in cracks. Faint bread from ovens gone quiet. The wall feels less like a fortress now, and more like a cradle, something that holds shelters, watches. You close your eyes, listening to the rhythm, water, wind, wood, stone. Each takes its turn, none hurrying. And as you lean against the wall one last time, you realize the building was never only about defense. It was about togetherness. The laughter in the rain, the songs during lifts, the charms hidden in mortar, the bell's first proud call. It was about being more than scattered cottages, more than farmers alone in fields. It was about becoming a village with a heartbeat you could hear, a crown you could see, and a memory you could touch. So let your breath settle. Let your thoughts drift like the moat's gentle ripples. The wall is finished, the village safe for tonight, and the world can wait until morning. The stars look kindly on the battlements, the bell rests in its frame, and silence grows soft as wool.